Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's study session. Agendas for study sessions, including concept reviews, can be found by visiting Broomfield's website at broomfield.org. Our agenda this evening includes 5 study session items. Seeing there are no concept reviews on the agenda this evening, there will not be any public comment. You can watch the study session live on Channel 8 and through video streaming on Broomfield's website at broomfield.org/council meetings. For our hard of hearing residents present, we have wireless headsets available through our AV team in the back of the council chambers. Our first study session item this evening is a presentation from the Open Space and Trails Advisory Committee. Will the committee representative here this evening please come to the podium? Mr. McLean.
Mayor, no Mayor Pro Tem.
He's on his way.
Oh, well, okay. So I'm not going to greet him. And council as well as staff, thank you all for inviting Open Space and Trails Advisory Committee, otherwise known as OSTAC, to this evening so that we can provide some perspective on the work that we do. I will be providing you with a brief overview of the committee's functions, some of our current major projects and events, and also at the end, a quick peek into all of our volunteers and members who help fulfill our Broomfield Open Space vision. But first, I want to start and provide you with some insights as to why open space and trails are critical to our collective happiness and needs, and hopefully find you a different way to view open space and trails. Next slide, please. Nestled in the eastern mountain range of the Himalayan range is the kingdom, very tiny kingdom of Bhutan. This tiny country defined a constitutional index called gross national happiness, otherwise known as GNH. Gross national happiness is a measurement index that states that sustainable development needs to take a holistic approach towards notions of progress and of giving equal importance to the non-economic aspects of well-being, valuing the citizens' collective happiness as the goal of good governance and emphasizing harmony with nature. Now, this GNH governance index embeds the science that was popularized by Dr., I believe, Edward Wilson. He is a biologist back in 1984 when he published a book called Biophilia. Biophilia coming from the Greek, bio, life, philia, love, the love of life, the love of nature. Now, this approach that he took, he wrote up and called the biophilia hypothesis. And it suggests that both from anecdotal as well as qualitative evidence that humans possess an innate need, not a want, a need to seek connections with nature and other forms of life. So what's OSTAC got to do with any of that, right? Simple. We provide staff with that additional perspective from the community on how our own love of nature intersects with the projects and the programs coming from Broomfield's Open Space and Trails Department. So, how is the scope of OSTAC defined? Next slide, please. OSTAC was codified under the Administration and Personnel Municipal Code of Broomfield. The scope of the committee being to provide perspective and recommendations on a wide range of biophilia-related concepts. In other words, we review the efforts and the projects and works of our open space and trails regarding these natural environments that the entire team resonates with, including all those borders along Broomfield, all that open space, all those trails, all the wonderful assets we provide our citizens. So with that as a background, let's now talk about some of our current major projects. Next slide, please. Back in late February, you were all briefed by our Director of Open Space and Trails, Kristen Pritz, on updates to our open space, parks, recreation, and trails master plan. That updated master plan was approved by you, and we are now focused on its implementation. While the master plan addressed a myriad of different subjects, I'm only going to focus on 3 of the bigger ones that we're currently in progress with, and that will involve OSTAC. Next slide, please. This existing open lands eye chart and reminder that you may need to see your optometrist gives you maybe at least a way for you to look at your particular district and get a sense of how much open lands are in your space that you work with your constituents on. I don't want to go there. I'm going to bypass. I hate staying with a script. It's terrible. So let's go to the next slide. This is a common open lands version that you've seen before, that you can distinguish on it all of the different numbers that we try to go to come up with our 36% and why we're at 36% of our 40% goal and how we do the accounting of the numbers of that acreage. That's the calculations. Please note though, near the bottom, it talks about the PLD, the public land dedication. That was one of the big changes that you saw come across in our open space and parks big plan, where we were talking about things that need to change. Why do they need to change? They need to change to reflect current reality of we need affordable housing. So we need to look at some of that land different. We have infill projects that are really, really difficult to pull off. We need to potentially look at those public land dedications differently, which you all approved. So now we're in the process of how does all this come together, right? So that's the difficult and not so fun part necessarily. But it does list, if you're clear about Broomfield and our size, you might notice that the acreage is too big. We're not that big, but that does include, because we don't want to mess up our denominator and numerators in our divisions and coming up with our percentages, the fact that we have these parcels that are part of intergovernmental agreements that are part of our open space, as well as the major one being Boulder's open space. So you'll see that those sizes, if you try to match it up with our actual footprint, don't match up, but that's why. Next slide, please. And lastly, from our open space and parks and recreation master plan, trails master plan, just a real brief overview of our trail system. The great thing about our trail system is it's always expanding, it's always changing. The really bad news about that is that means our maps are almost always out of date, and we try like heck to keep them up to date, but it's almost an impossible task. The good news is that technology does have the potential to enhance access to our trails, and that would go well beyond the printed map. And I think, no, I'm quite certain, you will hear about some new ones that will be rolling out when you show up at our National Trails Day. Mm-hmm. So we've got more coming. There's more fun on the way. And while I don't have any trail usage statistics, I can tell you one thing about my own observations, anecdotally, and I'm on the trails all the time. I think some of you know that about me. The trail system kept people healthy through the pandemic that we all suffered through, mentally, physically. And the trail system usage, from my perspective, has continued to stay engaged more than it was 5 years ago. Why? Biophilia, that love of nature. Next slide, please. So there's 3 other current projects for your consideration this evening that I wanted to highlight. The first is our Raptor Management Plan, which will be coming to council probably summer, fall, somewhere in there. Its implementation will help to protect our raptors, identify and enhance their raptor habitats, and provide recommendations for best practices to promote raptor breeding and successful nesting. There's actually a Broomfield Voice page. Hopefully you've all had a chance to look at the commentary from our citizens out there. And there's a whole lot more detail than I'm going to go into that's on the plan out there. But this effort to respect and encourage living in harmony with wildlife is found throughout the world amongst all indigenous cultures. It's amazing. All indigenous cultures. They all share this respect for living in harmony with your environment, with your wildlife. That would have included the Utes, the Arapahoes. It includes people that are near and dear to our hearts. And these cultures all just recognize that humans, plants, animals, and the land all depend on one another for survival. So to develop in a sustainable way, we need to make sure we're accounting for that non-monetary build out of allowing for nature and land and humans to all get along. Next slide, please. Next is the Markle and Wattage Open Space Management Plan. These are also both approved by council already. And we're now entering into an implementation phase to establish those trails that we defined and the neighborhood connections and the other improvements that'll go into these lands. Very similar in many respects. If you think about Broomfield, we don't have a lot of variation, frankly, in the geography. So if you've been to any of the field, over to Metzger Farm, up into the BCC, any of these places, you'll see our trail system is pretty consistent. Gee, you're not having to put in all these staircases, or we're not having to do all sorts of things. We can have nice natural trails with a lot of open space in between that allows people to ingest and feel good about the nature around them that they're able to observe and the wildlife that most of them get to see. Next slide, please. The last of the 3 projects I wanted to talk about is our signage effort, or as I like to call it, the How to Not Get Lost on the Trails Network signs. This is a good project, and it was also approved, and we are also in an implementation phase with this one. And it includes kiosks for educational purposes, help people understand about what wildlife to expect in different type of areas. Is it a blue space, meaning a place with water, as opposed to a green space? Is it a blue space? And what type of animals might be there? If it's just a green space or a wooded area, what type of animals might be there? Kiosks help train people to reconnect to what they don't know if they grew up, like I did, in New York, where there aren't a lot of things that aren't concrete. So this, to go back to it, these helpful signs will cover or help people to cover our 350 plus miles of trails and feel comfortable and confident. Next slide. OSTAC is also kept keenly aware of the community events that the Open Space and Trails Department helps to host. OSTAC provides feedback and recommendations when we're told about things, including these events. And as each member has interest, a lot of them will go out and assist. I know of a number of people who for years who have been on the committee who just had to put fishing poles together for the fishing derby every year because it just was their thing. So it allows them that outlet. Next slide, please. This is your committee. These are the members of the advisory committee, and I'm going to call them all up and ask them to introduce themselves.
Thank you.
If you all would, please.
Hi, good evening. I'm Joel Niles.
Good evening, I'm Chandler Edie.
I'm Jessica Crowley.
Hi, my name's Renee Stavros.
Vice Chair.
Congratulations.
I'm River Peranto. I'm Ava Falsing. I'm Alexis Sweet.
Nice to meet you all in person.
Next slide, please. OSTAC also hears about and focuses on other open space and trails volunteer programs. And in fact, often we have members of Open Space and Trails Advisory Committee participating in one or more of these. If you look up there, you'll see numbers. That's the number of people who volunteer for those particular specialities, and it's over 100 volunteers. So there's a lot of people who are involved, and they all do that for the same reason. Biophilia, the love of nature. So now you have had a 50,000-foot view of OSTAC functions and our major current projects and events. And lastly, a quick peek into the volunteers who make that vision possible in assisting the department. And if you find the concept of love of nature, of biophilia, to be of interest, it just so happens, and I didn't know this until yesterday, that Denver Arts Museum happens to have an exhibit on biophilia going on right now.
Wow.
So I haven't seen it, don't know if it's any good, but I thought you might be interested. But it's there to highlight the transformative, not transformative, where's that word come from? Power of nature. So it should be interesting. And lastly, as a challenge to you all, I don't know if Broomfield would be interested in defining gross county happiness and finding a way to measure it. But you know, I think you all know, if you don't measure, it doesn't happen, right? So if you do want to go there, keep in mind that you would be joining the likes of the United Nations, the city of Victoria in British Columbia, the state of São Paulo in Brazil, the city of Seattle, Washington, the state of Vermont, who have all implemented their own variation of how do we do the 4 pillars of sustainability for build outs, of making sure that our people are happy and nurtured by the need that they have to connect with nature. So that's my overview. Questions?
Thank you very much, Mr. McLean. That was beautiful. We will go to council questions or comments, using your button. We have buttons now. Let me know who wants to go first. I'll wait. All right, Councilmember Nguyen.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you so much for your presentation, and to the rest of the committee. Thank you so much for your volunteerism and your service to the community. Being the new guy here in the council, I want to highlight the importance of making sure that our trails, our community stays green, that we have the ability, like you mentioned, to have access to it. And I think that the work you do is very important to make sure that council and the community of Broomfield make sure that we do keep our wildlife sacred, make sure that our lands are beautiful for future generations. Again, I just want to say thank you so much for, again, your continued volunteerism in our community. And no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Councilmember Lim.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I was glad to see the Trail Ambassador Program roll out. I had a number of Ward 3 residents, especially in the Lackamoor area, who were interested in helping on the trails and have previously, but wanted to formalize that in a greater way. So I was glad to see that roll out. I did have a question recently from a Lackamoor resident about Josh's Pond. And the answer came back that there was going to be an effort to look into pond management in general. And I just wondered if the OSTAC had discussed that at all yet, or is that still a behind the scenes staff discussion?
Yeah, I was gonna say that hasn't come up yet, though we've near Josh's Pond, we were reviewing some development with regards to the pump station, correct? So we do know about the pump station that's having to change down there, and we have reviewed that, but not in light of what you're looking for an answer on, no.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Councilmember Henkel.
Thank you, Mayor. I wanted to apologize for my tardiness. I don't think I've actually ever been late to council, so I apologize. I came in and I was immediately entranced by your voice, first of all. And it just kind of reminds me of just how peaceful it is in nature. And biophilia is one of the words we used to teach in biology class when I was a high school teacher. We would teach Latin and Greek, and there's just such a great grounding sense that when you speak of the earth, there is a lot of, grounding sense. And so I really appreciate that. I love the fact, did you say 350 miles? Is that right? Of connected trails. What I would love to know, just sort of what other programs that you guys are working on as far as working on ways to increase, like you said, we really survived the pandemic through the trail system, and I completely agree. We saw a lot of increase in the trail usage. We saw, people getting outside more, which is what I think we need. It's interesting that Broomfield is actually one of the places where, we're known for having access to being able to work from home. My husband and I both work from home, and we both go out and walk our dog in order to get out of the house and experience the surrounding areas. Would you explain or maybe expand on any programming that you guys have thought of as far as mental health awareness or other groups that use the trails for mental health purposes?
To me, that would be a tricky thing because there's other departments that are focused on that, and we wouldn't want to step into their shoes. However, that is something where I can see some crossover that could probably be developed, though I don't think we've touched on that in my 500 years of being on OSTAC.
500.
Is that reasonable?
There's definitely the
Mhm.
connection and Broomfield 100.
Oh, that's true.
And
Yeah, so the Broomfield 100 would be one of our ways of encouraging people to get out. And they want to because they're going to see some of the new tech that's rolling out and some of the really cool things that they get if they do the Broomfield 100.
Yeah, we did see the online map. I thought that was really cool. Yeah, I would love to, see even groups, and if I know of any, reach out to you all, in ways that they could use the trail systems, to increase mental health. The reason why I thought about it, our refugees in Broomfield, we have a mental health grant.
Hmm.
And I know, that they love our trails. That's one of the things that they love. And I think a big part of it is, our Afghans, for instance, the mountains really remind them of home and they can really see the mountains. And so I know, that the Colorado Refugee Services Program is working on some more mental health grants as far as increasing, access even to the mountains and to trail systems. So I know that there would be increasing partners, and I would love for even our public health department to even look into that and explore that. I think that'd be great.
That would be
Thank
cool.
you so much for your presentation. This is lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Leslie.
Thank you, Mayor. Congratulations, team. It's a really wonderful presentation. And I think contribute a great deal to Broomfield being listed as one of the healthiest counties and one of the best places to live. We just learned tonight, I won't take the mayor's thunder, but something else related, which she'll announce in a little bit. It just makes our lives that much healthier. I just got back from Yellowstone, literally this afternoon. So my question is, when are we going to start seeding bison and bears on the trail system?
I heard there's a story about bears recently too.
Yeah, right. It was such a thrill to be out there. But what really overwhelmed me was two things. One, on the drive back from Yellowstone, coming through Wyoming, again, there's open space forever until you get to Colorado.
Yeah.
And it starts to close in a bit. So this is so important that we protect this and keep this alive. And secondarily, I like to ride my mountain bike. I live in Anthem Ranch, and so actually I'm riding in the Boulder side
Mhm.
of things, which reminds me that our trails connect not just to Boulder and to Lafayette and Louisville and all through, but I mean, we can go so much further through our trail system. It's not just limited to the acreage of Broomfield. It goes well beyond that. But secondarily, I'd love to see some connection with the bicycling community because our roads are trails as well. And we have to take care of them. We have to make those hospitable to bikers. And I think there's another opportunity here for our trail system to enlarge itself, if you will, by including that element to the wonderful work you're doing. I had the pleasure of traveling with 35 other people on our photo organization in Anthem Ranch and talking about the trail system and giving them the numbers, the goal, the 40%, et cetera. And most of my colleagues were not that aware of the numbers. They were aware of the trail system, of course, but not of the numbers. And so they were all very impressed with that as well. So I think all of us need to be ambassadors for the program. But I thank all of you volunteers for the work that you're doing and want to see it obviously reach, if not exceed the goal. But I would like to encourage perhaps some additional elements that show how you can go from here to other places on the trails, on your bicycle, whatever it may be, because it's so much larger than just us, if you will. And then I guess the final thing, back to the animals, I'm only half serious about bears. Bison, yes, but maybe not bears. But the more we can do to encourage, like the Raptor program you mentioned, perhaps even more education around the different animal life. We're kind of used to coyotes. And so when all those people in Yellowstone were coming together for a coyote site and 50 cars were blocking traffic and everything like that, we all passed by without a second glance. So I know those guys. Show me a wolf, not a. But we can get spoiled by the fact that we don't think about birds and we don't think about animals. And so we kind of take them for granted. And yet I know birds are under duress, just as other wild forms are under duress. So the more we can do to protect them, the better. So I just want to encourage you all, to continue to pursue that. Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you. I think to some extent to respond to the idea of the cycling community, I think our trail ambassadors will be taking some of that effort. We've seen all sorts of conflicts that can arise on trails, especially when you have different modes of movement through there, whether it be runners or cyclists or people who are on some nifty one wheel or whatever. You know, there's all sorts of potential there for conflict. And that's a lot of what the trail ambassadors are going to be out there doing. And since it's brand new and nobody really has seen them yet, come again on our National Trails Day, because I think they're actually going to lead the cycling. Yes, they are. Cool.
That's awesome. I love that. We have that to look forward to, the unveiling of some new surprises. Anyone else on council have any questions or comments? Well, the news was I got a letter from the Arbor Day Foundation that Broomfield earned a recognition as a 2023 Tree City USA designation because we plant and care for our trees. And we are part of a network of 3,600 Tree City USA communities nationwide with a combined population of 155 million people. So congratulations us. And that we'll be talking about trees later on. But I mean, look at that picture. I remember when we first were looking for a place to live 11 years ago. I couldn't put my finger on what made Broomfield different than the other places we were looking. It just felt wide open, right? I didn't know it was planned. I didn't know it was intentional. It's just like you could see for miles here. And coming from Los Angeles, you know, that just didn't happen. So after I got a little more involved, I realized this was all by design. It was intentional. And we've forever protected open space in the middle of Broomfield. I mean, that's the beauty of it. It's going to be on the perimeters, but it's in the middle too. So everyone has access to these amazing places. And we live in the Broadlands near the Plaster Reservoir. So we see a lot of waterfowl, and the geese come, you know, every year, and they mate, and they always have the same pair that has some goslings. Well, they were missing for a few days last week, and I kid you not that we went into depression. We thought that raccoons got them or something, and I was truly sad. And then they popped up again yesterday, and the world is right again. So you get attached to your neighbors, and they peacefully coexist with the golfers, amazingly. But open space is very important. It was the reason why I ran for council in 2017. To protect our open space from oil and gas exploration. And while I wasn't successful in stopping that project, I can tell you unequivocally that it will never happen again. We future-proofed it. And so thanks to all of you for your work on that. And just thank you for continuing to protect these spaces that we all treasure. It's what makes Broomfield so unique. And why we choose to live here. So thank you, Mr. McLean. Thank you, Open Space and Trails Committee, and Kristen. Look forward to seeing y'all on the 1st.
Thank you.
Thank you. So switching gears, our next study session item this evening is an energy code update. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, which I'll ask our staff to summarize.
As the fun group moves to the door.
Bye, fun folks.
I didn't want to steal any thunder, but again, coincidental timing. Kristen Pritz and Sarah Grant, Katie Allen, myself and Abby met today about what it looks like to connect the trails with the biking community. And again, we refer to it as wayfinding. So if we don't have a trail from trailhead to trailhead, how do we get people through the community from each one of those trailheads? So Sarah, you all will have an email by the end of the week with some really great information. And we wanted to roll it out in conjunction with Bike to Work Day, which is on June 26th. So we will have it ready by then to
to kind of do the quiet jazz hands about it. So, yeah, I didn't want to take anything away from OSTAC to announce that the bike piece, but Sarah's all over it. So thank you. And with that, Ms. Burton-Zetti, as I was saying, that concludes the meeting for this evening.
Well, we've got a few things to go over this evening. The first of the three from the Community Development Department is the Energy Code Roadmap. If I could have the next slide, please. So staff is bringing forward this study session item. It's really an update from the last roadmap that we showed you about a year ago in April of 2023. But as we discussed in the memorandum that was presented for this item tonight, there's been a number of things that have changed over the last year that have really impacted our ability to move forward in the timeframes that we had originally anticipated when we talked about this about a year ago. So on the map or on the screen is the roadmap that we had put together back in April of 2023. And this showed three primary phases that we were hoping to move forward. The first of which, even back in 2023 in April, we were already had passed. Phase one of the roadmap was adopting the 2021 International Energy Code, Energy Conservation Code, as well as adopting some changes to the municipal code to require electric vehicle charging stations with new development in PUD districts. So both of those things were completed, and we consider that phase one of our movement towards the energy code strengthening. Phase two was what we considered through council's adoption last summer of the state's energy code, the 2023 energy code. So that was a model code that was created, drafted by the state energy board and intended to be adopted by cities throughout Colorado. Broomfield was one of the first to adopt that last summer, and it is now effective in Broomfield. And phase three, as we identified it last year, was to then consider strengthening amendments concurrent with the adoption of the 2024 energy code. And that brings us to today. So next slide, please. Unfortunately, we had hoped that the 2024 IECC, International Energy Conservation Code, would have been published hopefully last fall, end of the year, but it didn't happen. So then we were hoping it would be early in 2024, and it still hasn't been published. And now we're hoping maybe by the end of May, we will see the published IECC 2024 edition. So while we're waiting for this code to be finalized and be published, the state model low energy and carbon code began to also move forward. And similar to the last model code, we're very fortunate that Broomfield's chief building official, Tim Pate, will again serve on the energy code board. So we're very familiar with how that board will be moving forward with their plans. We'll be able to bring that forward in a timely fashion. But again, that is just starting to mobilize now. Things just continue to keep moving around on us. And recently there was House Bill 24214 that was recently signed into law that moved the required completion of that next model code from June of next year to September of next year. So we are anticipating, again, some changes to our ability to move things forward on the roadmap as intended due to some factors that are out of our control. Next slide, please. So again, the 2024 code is of interest to Broomfield because we believe that it will probably have more energy saving opportunities, more energy efficiencies. And under our typical timelines, we would have looked at considering movement to the 2024 code in about 2026. So we're still currently looking at an early adoption potentially of the 2024 code. It would be about a year ahead of schedule. One of the big changes that we anticipate being included in the published, when it is, 2024 code is that all new commercial and multifamily residential that has over 3 stories in height will be required to have renewable energy installed on site. So probably solar. That will come with a significant cost impact for new developments. It's also possible that the State Energy Code Group will look to expand that requirement to developments that are 3 stories or less that are multifamily. So it's potential that there could be some significant, that's just one example, financial impacts to moving to the 2024 code. So these types of amendments could have a potential significant impact on energy efficiency and carbon reduction, but they will come with a cost for development in Broomfield and other communities that move towards these. So typically, the Department of Energy analyzes the new IECC and would provide some analysis, both the cost savings from the energy efficiencies as well as the upfront costs, that then communities can look at and utilize as they consider whether to move forward to these next codes. We don't believe that that will be available for over a year from the date that the IECC is published. We're fortunate that the code board for the state has hired a consultant and will be looking at having some analysis done earlier than that. We're potentially as soon as later this year, more likely, I'm guessing, early in 2025. But we will have some financial analysis of some of these energy efficiency requirements that are likely to be included in the 24 plan as well as in the model energy code. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the Model Energy Code Board is reconvening. They're looking at, in this next step, at another model code. The intent with this next step is to develop a code that minimizes overall carbon dioxide emissions that are associated with new development as well as redevelopment. And it'll use elements from the 2021 IECC or 2024, whichever it deems to be most energy efficient. And the process for developing the Model Energy Code will have a completely separate public engagement process that's handled by the state through their own process. And we provided some additional information on, linked in our memorandum regarding the work of the board and their plans moving forward. Next slide, please. So that really brings us forward to what we wanted to present today and what we've brought forward to ACES as well to give them an update. And that's that we've updated our roadmap into really 4 phases. So we broke phase 3 into potentially 2 phases. So based on all these moving pieces, we now anticipate that we would have start over. Too many words tonight. First thing would be moving to the 2025 Model Energy Code once it's published by the state. Our plan would be to bring forward a study session sometime in mid-2025. I think on the screen it says late spring, but it's late spring to mid-2025 because we would really be at the mercy of the state code trying to determine when we have a draft that we believe is in a place to bring it forward for City Council's review. And that's similar to what we did last year, where we brought forward a study session and discussed the draft of the model code. And then after it was finalized, we brought forward the ordinance that adopted it and gave updates as to what changed between the draft and the final. And that's the model that we would use moving forward. So it would be a study session in late spring 2025 to mid 2025 when we have a draft of the state model energy code. We would take a look at that code and council could consider whether or not to move to that code. We would have the benefit of the financial analysis that the state code board had looked at as part of their analysis as well. We would be looking at potentially an effective date of January 1st. But as I'm going to talk about with ACES, they were looking for us to look at an expedited effective date if possible. So we'll consider that when we bring forward the study session next year as well. What we broke into phase 3B was then the consideration of early adoption of the 2024 IECC, as well as any additional strengthening amendments. And really, we broke that apart because we're not sure what the state model energy code will really use. What elements from the 21 versus the 24 will it use? How complex will it be? Will it primarily already be using the 24 code, in which case it may make sense to look at consideration of the adoption of the 24 plan with the state model energy code at the exact same time. So it's just a little too early for us to say. So we broke it into 2 phases. That would also be a time during the study session next year to look at what other strengthening amendments council may wish to go to. And again, it's a little early for us to say what that could possibly be, not knowing what is going to be in the state model energy code and not seeing the final version of the 24. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we did bring this to ACES. They supported the roadmap as it's presented with the revised timeframes. But as I mentioned, they wanted to look at an expedited adoption of the ordinances and expedited effective date of the ordinances. Moving towards that as we look at those dates. We can certainly consider that as part of the study session. We would bring forward some more specific timeframes, both for the ordinance consideration as well as the effective dates. And we try to communicate with our development community early through these processes. So we'll start to include this type of discussion with developers that are coming through the process, letting them know that we are following closely the state model code, encourage them to follow that online themselves as well. And we'll continue to make sure that they're aware of it so that when we potentially do consider moving towards it, it's not a surprise for anyone in the development community, so that we can potentially move more quickly towards adoption and effective date. Next slide, please. So what are we looking for this evening from council? We had two primary questions that we had outlined in our memorandum. First, wanting to make sure that council supported moving forward with the energy code amendments as we outlined this evening in the revised roadmap. The second was related to whether council preferred moving forward with an interim step. And I didn't spend a lot of time with that in the presentation, but we go into more detail in the staff memorandum. So council can direct staff to look at adopting a local amendment, something that would be along the lines of an electric preferred code. This is not the direction that we are recommending as staff, primarily because it creates a series of amendments to our energy code in pretty quick succession. So we'd have what we just became effective in January 1st of this year, potentially something January 1st of next year, and then the next year again. So it's really hard for our development partners to adapt to those very quick, significant changes in the energy code. So that is something to consider. Also, the electric preferred codes, most of them that are utilized in the area, what we found in our analysis was that the codes that are most similar to example Erie's code, our developments are already meeting those requirements. So adopting the amendment to go to an electric preferred code really wouldn't have a change on the built environment in Broomfield, because the developments that are coming through our process already meet those requirements today. If we went to something that would have a more significant impact on energy efficiency, that would be modeling something closer to what Denver has in place. And there are more administrative complexities to what Denver has in place. For example, they have to have a specific software adapted for them by the Department of Energy. We'd have to have something very similar done for us. So we'd be left having to follow exactly what Denver did in order to piggyback on their software. Or if we made any type of amendment, would have to wait for the Department of Energy to create our custom software. So there's some complexities to moving to that. So that's why staff did not include it in the roadmap. But of course, we look to your direction and we'll follow whatever the direction is from City Council this evening. And that is the presentation we have for you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Burton-Zetti and Mr. Pate. We'll now go to council questions and comments. Who would like to hit their button first?
Mayor, if
Yes.
I may, before we go to council, one of the other conversation that staff has been having is we really need an opportunity to look at all the cumulative effects of the decisions that have been made over the last 24 months, so that we have a really good sense of what this means from a financial perspective. So decisions in and of themselves, there's been a lot that has occurred over the last 24 months and more to come when we talk about the enterprise fund and what the TAP fees are, what the development fees are, and what it looks to kind of right that ship. So we'd like to take a totality of circumstances so that council can make a well-informed decisions that we can forecast, which will be wrong, with what that tipping point is. How expensive are we going to make it? And what's the trade-off? And we're not going to be able to have that comprehensive conversation because we haven't seen the cumulative effects yet.
Great point, because it is a totality of increased costs for housing with the water sprinklers and all these things. Okay, so I get what you're saying. Hello, Mayor Pro Tem. Good, glad you could make it. So we'll go back to council questions, starting with Councilmember Leslie.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to reaffirm what you just said, Manager Hoffman. I would also like to I guess, encourage you all to also look at what the offsets might be. So in other words, if solar would be utilized, it's not just the cost of solar up front. There would be offsets to the owner, developer, whoever, by using solar as opposed to other forms of power. So there may be other places where that same kind of thing could play out so that the cost differential is not quite as extreme as it might appear at first glance. I think that would be very helpful if there is some possibilities of your adding that to the work you just described. Thank you.
It is, and Anna can, Ms. Bertanzetti can fill in some additional information. That's included in that comprehensive view because we can't make an informed or intentional decision without having each one of those components about what the trade-off is. Ms. Bertanzetti?
Thank you. Just to address that, it's one of the reasons that we feel it's really important to wait for the Department of Energy's analysis because it does take into consideration some of the efficiency savings. And I believe the state's consultant that they've hired is also doing that same thing. So Mr. Pate's confirming that that's also a part of their analysis that they'll be considering.
Mr. Councilmember Leslie, Councilmember Cohen.
Thank you, Mayor. I just had a quick question. If you could clarify for me, you cited the difference between Denver and Erie. But here's it's not just Erie, it's Lafayette, Superior, North Bend. Basically, all our surrounding communities have already done have already adopted these codes. Is that correct?
Currently, Superior, Lafayette, in Louisville, and I think Boulder has done an electric preferred type of a code. Boulder is on its way to all electric this summer, but they're right now a little bit electric preferred.
But that explains why a lot of our developers are already meeting those requirements because they have to and all that.
Not necessarily. My opinion is based on the review that we've done with the builders that we see the way they build by choice is above what the 21 energy code is and that they will comply. So they won't, if you're looking to try to get electric preferred, that won't happen because they're able to meet the other part of the design requirements by using mixed fuel.
Okay. So you're sort of telling us it really doesn't matter if we had moved forward now versus waiting for the codes next year. It's already sort of happening.
That's correct.
Correct. Okay.
Based on my analysis of our builders versus and the city of Denver is a very much more aggressive code adoption, but they also went through a very aggressive path to get there, like over 2 years with a lot of community engagement and many subcommittees, much more than our staffing.
Well, you've detailed that Denver is obviously a much more difficult procedure. I'm just curious, what do they achieve in terms of energy? Is there a tangible difference in terms of the efficiencies that they're hoping or planning to achieve compared to what the rest of us are doing?
I don't think it's been in place long enough to see any type of data to come back through.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Councilmember Marshallson. Oh, I did that wrong. Okay, you win.
Okay, I'll go next. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. One quick question, and then a few comments. Actually, a few questions. When talking about the like solar power and in the codes, renewable energy sources, does that include any of the conversations that we've been hearing about the wind for residential?
So I'll take that one because I don't think Tim's been as directly involved, but so renewable energy could be wind. We say it's commonly solar panels. That's what we see the builders typically build. But no, it is not directly related to the emails that council has received in regard to micro wind turbines. At this point in time, staff is going to include that as part of our work plan moving forward, understanding that that might be a direction the community is looking at and other communities are looking at as well. We are not considering that as part of this process. It would be an amendment to the zoning code, so the municipal code in Title 17, and that would be a separate process.
But if we did amend the code and people could go forward with micro turbines, that would count towards renewable energy. Okay.
I believe that would count.
Yes, there are only 3 renewable energy options on the table that I'm aware of: geothermal, solar, or wind. The effective use to get wind, from what my research has been, needs to be about 35 feet tall to be able to capture enough wind. There's a lot of different research out there, but that's been my experience.
Okay, thank you. How often are these codes updated by the state in the model code? I know we talked about the 21, then 24, 25. I know we've talked about delaying our strengthening amendments until something else happens, but if we have to keep doing it every few years, I guess the question is that, yeah, how often are they done?
The International Code Council package is updated every 3 years. So the 2024 package has been completed, other than the energy code, for about 4 or 5 months now. We're currently under review to update the 24 nationally to the 2027. So, and I've been bringing the code package to the council every 3 years on that standard. So April 15th of 2023 was the last time that I brought to council and adopted the 21. The state energy code is a little different because that was based on a piece of state legislation from a couple of years ago that had a 2-phase portion to that, to do the electric ready and solar ready code, which we completed, and actually I brought to council and we adopted that as of for January 1st. Now the second phase, which is the last part of that, is under review, and I'm helping work on that, and that'll be complete and ready to go in 1.5 years based on that information. I don't anticipate, but if the state legislation next time around has some time on their hands to do another piece of legislation to fit in with everything else, they may do something else, but
Okay,
I
so
doubt it.
once the state energy code is done, that it's done for the foreseeable future until they change it again? Until the legislature decides to change it.
That's what we would anticipate if we bring this package. It'll be based on the 24. I know that for a fact, based on the discussions, our energy code board. And then that'll be part of it'll be an expanded 2024 IECC package. And then the next would be the 2027 package, which would be in another 3 years.
Okay, thank you. And in the memo, talking about, it lists out the different communities: Denver, Erie, Superior, North Glen. They are all saying electric preferred. Lafayette, Louisville, and then obviously Boulder, they say requires new residential commercial to be all electric. So what's the difference between Lafayette, Louisville, Boulder, and the other?
So Lafayette currently, or a year ago, adopted an all electric code, and the exception was in that ordinance was for PUDs that were already approved. And based on my discussion with the building official there have not been any new PUDs brought forward that would end up needing to comply with the all electric. So they don't have any experience with what that looks like for enforcement. Louisville is really not all electric because it's got electric preferred amendments embedded in it. Boulder will be all electric when they go to their council this summer. Which was the other one you were asking, sorry?
Those are the ones I was asking about.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I'm not that familiar with that one.
And question for Ms. Rogers on those. Denver's currently is there a lawsuit in Denver regarding all electric? Okay, but, and then the Berkeley, are you familiar with that case?
Yes.
How does that, I mean, I know that's a Ninth Circuit, doesn't directly apply to us, but how does that, how would an all electric code in Broomfield play in with those kinds of court rulings?
I know.
I know Berkeley was rescinded their codes, so it's not, because they weren't gonna appeal the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court under the current makeup of the court probably wouldn't rule their way, but. Okay. Okay.
Question. All right.
Those were my questions.
Thank you, Ms. Rogers.
Thank you,
Thank you, Councilmember. Next is Councilmember Lim.
I had read some articles that seem to indicate that the IECC code might not end up as, oh, I don't know what term to use, progressive as originally anticipated, and that it might be in the strengthening amendments, some of what had previously been thought of to be in the body of the code would instead be placed in strengthening amendments. Would you comment on that?
Yes. So what ended up happening with the 2004 Energy Code process is there were 3 or 4 different sections that were voted in by the Standards Committee that was putting together the 24 into the body of the code. And there were a number of groups that appealed that decision. And the appeals went to the International Code Council Appeals Board, which I think 6 or 7 people. And they were all upheld, the appeals. And then it went to the International Code Council Board of Directors. And the Board of Directors, there's like 14 maybe, they overturned and forced a certain number of sections to be taken out of the body of the code and put them into appendices, and even a couple of them to put in as a resource type of an appendix, all because of the proposed question of preemption from the federal. What he was talking about from the Berkeley, there's another one down in Albuquerque. There's some legislation, I believe, that just came up against the city of Denver from some group. I haven't got my hands on that particular legislation. So it was overreaching. The appeals were that the IECC was becoming overreaching from being energy efficiency.
Okay.
So those appendices, we've got a draft. The Energy Code Board has a draft. It's not 100%, it's red line draft that they were able to get from ICC, and that's what we are starting our whole review based on that. And it's the board's ability. The board has the ability to adopt some or all of those appendices. But the resources will not be able to be adoptable, I don't think. We're still waiting on a final determination from the state attorney who represents the energy. That's why it's been delayed so much. Yep. So that's all part of the state board, Energy Code Board discussion with what we're able to vote to become involved, to be able to put with the phase 2, which would be what we eventually bring.
Okay. I guess, given what I had read about the international code, and you explained, so, and I did not know that there was possibly a prohibition in the state legislation that the state could not adopt something that was in either the IECC code or the strengthening amendments. Is that what I understood you to say?
Might have miscommunicated that. I
Okay.
don't think I said it that way.
Okay.
I'm sorry. So the State Energy Code Board has the authority to review and writing this low carbon code, but it's going to be based on the 2024 IECC as written. We can do some modifications, some amendments, and we have the ability to adopt some none or all of the appendices that are now, I think there's gonna be like 8 or 9 of them now, with different strengthening amendments, appendices. So I don't know where that's gonna be. If we were just bringing the 2024 IECC to council, we also right now could have the ability, once it's published, to adopt any one of those if we chose to. But it's better, I think, to wait for the state code that's going to be adopted and then promulgated all the way across the whole state. And I will point out with the second phase, there are probably going to be 5, I think, public meetings to get feedback from across the country. I'm sorry, across the state, probably other people who are watching this. And so we're doing a really good job. The Energy Code CEO is doing a really good job getting that feedback for how this is going to end up. So I think that's really important for us when we take it, bring it to council for your discussion, that we know we're getting something that's going to work throughout the state.
And where does your inclination come from that you think that it's possible that the state will adopt some kind of solar infrastructure requirement?
Well, right now, the body of the Energy Code, 2024 Energy Code on the commercial portion has a requirement for all commercial new buildings, which would include 4-story or more multifamily, to provide on-site renewable. And if you can't get on-site renewable, you have to get off-site renewable, which would be renewable energy certificates that you have to buy off market, which are very, very hard to get right now in a timely manner. So that's in the body of the code.
I think we're just doing comments and questions at the same time with study sessions. There's a large lapse, certainly a longer lapse of time, and I understand the considerations now. We don't want to put intermediary steps in for the developers, but there's a longer length of time certainly to go electric preferred than we had originally anticipated. So my thought would be, would it be possible, especially if the solar infrastructure part of the state code doesn't come forward, for us to say, okay, we're just going to look at the all electric possibility in Broomfield instead of we've lapsed a long time with when the other jurisdictions have already gone to electric preferred.
If I'm understanding the question correctly, I think what we had intended was that next late spring, mid-year, when we bring back a study session, we'd have a better understanding of where the state model code is going. And that would be the time that we then seek direction from city council in terms of, this is the minimum that now is in the state model code. Is that far enough for what Brimfield is seeking? Or is there another step further? And it's one reason that we broke out phase 3 into phase 3A and B, because that's really the direction that we will be asking for at that study session. So in addition to moving to the state model code, which will be mandated that we move towards it when we next do an update, what other strengthening amendments would council like us to consider? And that could be done at the same time or in a subsequent timeframe. And one of those could be electric only.
Okay, so you don't need to hear from council on that at this moment, but you're telling us that it will be a possibility for us to talk about that in well, you said mid 2025.
Right, I think it'll be mid 2025. We're really at the mercy of trying to figure out when that first published draft is provided that we feel is really ready for us to fully analyze and bring forward to city council.
Okay, thanks. Those are my questions.
All right, thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Schaaf.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Payton, Ms. Burton-Setti, for your expertise and work on this information. I do support moving forward with the revised phasing of the energy code amendments, waiting on any strengthening amendments until after concurrent with the consideration of the next state model code. I do not support utilizing additional state staff resources at this time by moving forward with an interim step, though. So I do support the timeline that you have set, and I appreciate it. Thanks, Mayor. That's all I have.
Thank you for that brevity. Councilmember Ward.
Thank you, Mayor. I just have a couple questions that came up during the presentation. I think it was Ms. Burton-Zeta, you had mentioned that there's a requirement, and then I think Mr. Payne, you had reaffirmed that the state model code is going to have a requirement for on-site renewable for all new commercial, which for some reason they decided to include multifamily above 3 stories. How much do they have to provide? Do you know how much they're going to have to provide on-site? Is it 100%? Is it just partial?
Yes, 100%.
Okay. I only ask about that because the letter or the, I shouldn't say letter, but the memo that was provided by NBI to the city of Golden talks about some of the issues with that, with density not being, or 4-story apartments or plus not being necessarily conducive to having that type of on-site without requiring more land or doing something else. My other question though is if the state's mandating that obviously, but if we were to do a electric only, is that part of the electric only from the AECC, or is that just because of the state legislation, we would have to do the on-site? I hope that question made sense. I apologize if it didn't.
The state energy code will not have requirements to be all electric. And just to be clear.
Yes. My question is, if we, as a body, were to decide to do electric only, is that requirement only coming from the state to provide the on-site renewable sources, or is that also part of the IECC's updated code?
The IECC does not have any all-electric requirements. So the one section that I was referring to is that you will be required to provide adequate on-site renewable energy. And if you can't get that, so the question of with Golden, if you have buildings that are infill and tall and they don't have enough roof area or land to support a ground array, then there will be, the developer would be required to provide off-site renewable certificates. So they have to go out on the market and buy them and produce that to provide. So it's either a mix of on-site and off-site, or all off-site, or all on-site. It's going to be those 3 choices. Does that answer that?
I think I might have just heard it a little bit differently, Councilmember Ward. The requirement we anticipate to be in both. So the 2024 will require it for new commercial and multifamily that's more than 3 stories. But what we anticipate could occur is that in the state model code, they would take that requirement and then expand it to be also for multifamily that's less than, or 3 stories or less. So it would end up being potentially in both.
Okay, thank you. That does answer that question.
And I'm sorry, if I could just add on. So on-site renewable would apply to mixed fuel buildings. So you'd still be able to do a mixed fuel, which would be gas, natural gas and electric. So hopefully that maybe clarifies that a little better. It's not stopping the mixed fuel, which is all part of some of that legislation that we've been hearing about that's cropping up in Berkeley, down in Albuquerque now recently, I think with Denver, who's going, and possibly Boulder. So, I mean, I think a lot of the jurisdictions are a little bit, their attorneys are starting to look at that. What's that potential if you choose to go down the all-electric path, and what's that potential for litigation, which sounds like it might be kind of high based on some of the stuff that's happening throughout the country.
Okay, thank you. I don't think I really have any other questions. I do appreciate the thorough document that was sent to council on the, including the history, because it's great to refresh our memory where we've been. We hear a lot. Maybe one other question, just to reaffirm what I had heard. If we were to move forward with a interim code amendment, we would not be expecting any savings in energy consumption by our developers because they're essentially already doing it. Is that what I heard?
Based on my analysis with projects that are currently in our system, the production home builders, along with 3 large commercial projects that are in for review, I compared their energy documents based on what the minimum requirements in the other 3, not Denver, but the other jurisdictions that have electric preferred. And they increased certain efficiency requirements to hopefully get the builder to go all electric. But what's happened is they're building it that way, or it just costs a little bit more to increase certain efficiencies, maybe more insulation, better windows, maybe go to a 95% efficiency mechanical system. And now they can still meet the electric preferred, but keep mixed fuel. So you're not, I mean, if you're trying to go down that path to encourage more all electric, it's not it would not work based on our current builders, if that makes sense. Yeah, so they're building, if we went to say the Erie code right now, the builders wouldn't have to change anything.
Okay.
So it wouldn't get what you're trying to do. You're preferring electric, but it's not gonna do it. It's not gonna get it, I guess.
Okay. I mean, I think based on that, I would support the phased approach. However, I will caveat it with saying I think we should move to an all-electric requirement at a much more expedited pace. But that's just all I have to say. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Ms. Rogers, you have a response for Councilmember Marshall.
I do. So on April 22nd, Denver, CDPHE, the APCD and Colorado Energy Office, so Denver and the state of Colorado were sued by the Colorado Apartment Association, Colorado Hotel and Lodging, and a couple other parties, mainly related to the regulations and laws about the 50,000 foot and 20,000 foot buildings. So, and this was based on the Berkeley decision, or the same theory. That decision came down this time last year, April of 2023, in the Ninth Circuit, as Councilmember Marshall mentioned. And pretty much what Berkeley did in that case is they tried to ban natural gas hookups to new buildings. And the preemption argument is that federal law allows the federal government to regulate on covered projects, air conditioners, stoves, stuff. And so the theory was by blocking natural gas, banning it in pipelines, you're essentially banning these projects or products and regulating these products, and you're preempted. And that won the day in Berkeley. To what's been mentioned, this law is in flux. There's only 30 cases citing this law, which is very few over the history of the law. The Denver case just got filed. Denver hasn't responded yet, neither has the state. So we're probably going to see a lot of movement in this area and find out what are the appropriate regulations that can fall in line with the federal law. I will tell you, there are a lot of exceptions to the federal law. There's a lot of way to regulate that falls in line with the federal law. It's very long. So it's not an absolute. It's not that all electric will in every situation violate this law. So that answers the question on this evolving legal landscape.
Thank you, Ms. Rogers. Councilmember Marshall, did you want to provide direction? I don't remember if you did, or if you're ready.
I did not. I was gonna wait till everyone else had spoken.
I'm trying to avoid a second round.
That's fine. So basically what Councilmember Lim and Ward have said is what I kind of feel too. I would rather move forward with this sooner than later, given that the climate is in dire crisis. But I understand the limitations of the state codes and all those kind of things. If it was something that the state code was happening every couple of years and we had to redo this every couple of years, I would be more comfortable moving forward right now. But since the state code is going to be done and then for the foreseeable future, I'm okay with the new phase approach. I will say that when we do move forward with it, I want to move forward with electric only as quickly as possible. So that's it. Thank you.
Next, Councilmember Henkel.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. It sounds like we're in a lot of preliminary discussions here, so I'm not going to belabor the point. I do support moving forward with the revised phasing of the energy code amendments with the caveat, like what you guys have all said about what does it look like when we look at our software systems? I'm sure our county assessors can appreciate that question with all of these tax codes being changed. And, other things like our workforce. What does our electrician workforce look like? I don't know what all the different constraints are, but I think if we really take in the planning efforts to really sort of, make sure that we have the support in the community to be able to do this in those regards with all of our different, different areas that we have to consider. I think that would be really important. I did read in here, alongside the gas lines, you need electric lines now, and I feel like our house could have benefited from that. Now we need a whole new panel on our house, and it's going to cost us quite a bit if we want to move from gas to electric. So I appreciate those efforts. There is a transition period that we do need to consider. And, when we're talking about Erie and Denver, our own infrastructure looks quite different. So I think that we need to look and we do need to work towards as a region though, and what it looks like for our grid. And then what it looks like for us to work together towards all of our goals. But I think that we are different than Erie and we are different than Denver and we have different constraints. So I support that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other council member feedback to provide direction? So is the consensus that we will support moving forward with the revised phasing of the energy code amendments? Everybody good with that? I agree. I think that I visited Dillon Point, one of our up and coming neighborhoods this past weekend to look at some of the models that still can't be finished because Xcel is not able to provide services. They've provided the lines to the homes, but not to the entire subdivision. So they have generators and they can't finish these homes. There's at least 14 families who purchased the home and just can't move in yet. So it's unfortunate. There are capacity issues right now and with so much growth everywhere. And then I'm concerned about the cost increase as we try to prioritize housing affordability. All of these costs add to that, take away that affordability. So thank you both for all of your hard work on this. And we'll be talking to you soon. Our next study session item this evening is a request for direction related to tree preservation requirements. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, which I'll ask our staff to summarize.
It is the Ms. Burton-Zeddy's show this evening. This is a little funner one, especially after winning another award. We're on a roll here with
Arbor
these,
Day, Tree City.
So here's a little fun fact.
Yeah.
What's a pirate's favorite holiday? Oh, Paloma. You're the winner, chicken dinner. Ms. Burton-Zeddy.
Thank you. Good evening again, Mayor, City Council. Kate Mack, our landscape architect, is going to walk us through this next item as we look for direction on a potential tree mitigation plan. Thank you.
Not mitigation.
Well, the words do appear several times next to each other. So hello, everyone. Can I have next slide, please? So I'm just going to jump right in. Currently, Broomfield does not have a structure in place to hold developers and contractors accountable for unauthorized tree removals or required replacement for trees damaged during the construction process. The purpose of creating this tree preservation code is to have requirements in place to preserve significant healthy trees in natural areas and maintain the existing tree population. Define protective barrier materials such as tree protection fencing and tree preservation principles, and also standardize the requirements. The proposed 2024 OSPRT plan encourages the adoption of a tree preservation standards. This tree preservation code incorporates the intent of the OSPRT plan and expands on the preservation requirements and applicability. By updating this code, Broomfield is not only able to promote tree preservation, but help guide the aesthetics and design of new development for the well-being of both the environment and the community. It will also align us with the surrounding municipalities that already have tree preservation codes in place. Next slide. So this table just gives you a quick overview of what the code proposes to do versus what it does not. Most importantly, the proposed code does not prohibit tree removal in Broomfield. However, it does provide requirements for mitigation, which I will cover in the next few slides. Following the recently adopted landscape code, the tree protection code would also apply to new development and redevelopment of residential, mixed use, and non-residential sites, with single-family residential and accessory dwelling units not having to adhere to these requirements. Next slide. A tree preservation plan will be required along with the landscape and irrigation plans. This plan is to be prepared by either a certified arborist or a licensed landscape architect and should include a tree inventory chart that specifies the size, species, and conditions of all trees identified on site following established forestry practices. Tree size is to be measured at 4.5 feet above ground, which is referred to DBH, that stands for diameter at breast height. This is a common measurement used by foresters and arborists to get above the trunk flare of growing and mature trees to determine an accurate measurement. The plan should identify all trees on site that have a 4-inch or greater DBH and all trees within 50 feet of the site boundary and or limit of work. Proposed methods and timeline for tree protection are also to be included on the plan, along with the construction schedule, maintenance schedule, and a watering schedule. The condition rating for tree preservation is on a scale of 1 to 6, with 1 being the highest rating and 6 being the lowest. Typically, trees with condition ratings of 5 or 6 do not require mitigation because it is often those trees that are either dead or considered non-desirable. The proposed rate of replacement is currently being 1-to-1 ratio. So this means that for each inch of tree removed, an equal amount of tree inches is to be replaced. An example of that is if an 8-inch tree were to be removed, 4 2-inch trees would be required for replacement. Mitigation trees are in addition to those required by the landscape plan. There will be times that it is not feasible to fit all the required trees on site, and forcing replacement trees onto the subject property just to replace on site may overcrowd trees and not follow proper forestry practices. With that, the following mitigation options are being suggested. The intent of this tree preservation code is to place all trees for replacement on the project property, and this will be highly encouraged during the design and review process. However, that may not be feasible. So some of the options are that we have developers that are often working on more than one project within Broomfield. And one option is to allow the replacement trees from one project to be placed on a different project under the same developer that may have more space for the additional trees. Another option to be explored prior to the cash in lieu option is to provide the replacement trees or any trees for transplanting to the Parks Department to use on Broomfield public land in their tree program. The cash in lieu option that is offered is intended to be a last resort, and this option can be proposed by the developer, but will still require the city forester to determine the appropriate fees. This is an option that also the surrounding municipalities do provide. So if applicable, the cash in lieu fee must be paid before the issuance of the first permit for construction. Within the memo, I did mention that there is a $125 per inch replacement rate that is currently a suggestion based on the neighboring municipalities and a starting point for discussion. That's approximately about mid-range of the surrounding municipalities and a rate that they are charging. This replacement rate will not be written into code, but it will reside within the landscape reference manual that I did create last year with our landscape code. And it will be subject to change as market rates change and as the forester sees fit. The same applies actually for the damage penalty. It's currently being proposed at $1,000 per instance, and that does include construction damage and construction traffic within tree protection zones. All trees that are damaged during construction will be evaluated and appraised, and these fines shall be independent of any applicable damage for the appraised value of the tree. The tree planting monies will be used for tree planting, including but not limited to support such as maintenance, installation of drip lines and drainage, and prevention programs, including the creation of new woodland areas, underplanting as part of a tree planting program, and other planting activities that support the purposes of this chapter. Next slide, please. So these are a couple examples of what we are trying to prevent. And having this tree preservation code in place is something that can kind of help protect the trees so they don't get this kind of damage during construction. While some municipalities require the orange plastic protective barrier for tree protection, it has been shown not to be sufficient to provide trees within to provide protection for trees within active construction sites. It is often not installed or secured properly to stay upright for the duration of the project and is easily moved. As you can see here, it can often be damaged during construction. And then the other picture does show stockpiling under the trees, which is also very damaging to trees. This is an example of what we are proposing to require for a protective barrier for trees during construction. The code is proposing a 6-foot-high chain link fence outside the drip line of the tree to create a tree protection zone. This tree protection zone is approximately 1.5 times the diameter of the tree. So if it was an 8-inch tree, the protective barrier would have a diameter of 12 feet. Currently, with the surrounding municipalities, both Denver and Westminster also require the chain link fence as a tree protection barrier. Tree protection fencing and other mitigation measures will need to be in place prior to the start of construction. Various inspections will need to be completed to confirm the required protection measures are in place. Those will include an existing conditions inspection, preservation methods, along with periodic inspections while on-site during construction, and a final inspection prior to removal. These inspections will need to be completed either by the landscape architect and/or Broomfield staff from Forestry and Parks. Some locations do have site constraints that don't allow for the overall diameter that is needed. Here, the sidewalk is used as an edge and the protective barrier is extended as much as feasibly possible. This is another example, and it shows how the protective barrier is protecting the tree from the surrounding construction activities. A chain link fence is currently requested for tree protection on construction sites within Broomfield. We have not received pushback on requesting the sturdier fencing from developers or contractors, and do find that it does a better job as a visual barrier as well as a physical barrier for tree protection. One of the goals of this tree preservation plan is to encourage intentional design on sites, encouraging designers to make all feasible attempts to accommodate existing trees and stands of trees within their designs. Requiring a tree preservation plan along with the landscape plan for project sites will further enable Broomfield to promote tree preservation and fulfill the purpose of this code. This presentation has been brought to ACES, OSTAC, and PRSAC, and all of these committees have expressed support for the tree preservation code. So for next steps, we will be having community engagement along with a Broomfield Voice page, social media, and I'll be having some version of an open house that will encourage comments from developers and other landscape architects and some of the other forestry departments that I've talked to within varying municipalities. The question I do have for council is, does City Council have concerns with this being applied to city projects? And if so, is there an interest in exempting Broomfield projects from these standards? So for next steps, I am aiming for a first reading in September if directed by council to proceed. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll now go to questions from council or comments. First, we have Councilmember Delgadillo.
I'm very excited to mention this one because the first presentation I went to at the urbanism conference I just came back from, talked about this actually. So I do want to say, I think this is great. I'm a big fan of this. Trees play a really important role in infrastructure preservation and thus long-term fiscal sustainability. Specifically, trees are really important for stormwater infrastructure. Not only do they provide a canopy from above, but they also absorb runoff from below. So I know that different trees have different maturities, have different absorption rates, but that's kind of generally the vibe. And so I am all in favor of this because it both preserves the look of Broomfield and it's also fiscally responsible, which is lovely. And so I have no concerns about this being applied to city projects, and I also have no questions. I just wanted to say I really like this idea. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Schaaf.
Thank you, Mayor. So I originate from Boise, Idaho, which is also known as Le Bois, which means the city of trees. So I have a great history of trees and a fond memory of trees. And so that's one of the reasons that I think a lot of people really enjoy Broomfield is our commitment to trees as well. One of the pieces that, one of the big questions that I had after reading this was around the cash in lieu. I know that with, when we talked about the affordable housing and housing ordinance, there had to be a cash in lieu included in there. Do we have to include a cash in lieu with this ordinance?
I see Anna walking because I'm happy to jump in and
We probably have very different angles that we're approaching this
yeah,
question.
so
go
the
ahead.
cash and move on affordable housing came straight out of the Telluride case, and it's specific to affordable housing. I do not believe there is any requirement that you have to do cash and live
Okay.
legally.
Oh, right. As I anticipated, we were approaching it from different angles. So legally, no requirement. But as Ms. Mack had mentioned, there may be some instances where we cannot find additional room on site. We may not have, the Parks Department may not have sites that we readily know that we need additional tree inventory for them to just move the tree to our site. So we had included it and feel it was a critical need for it to have a cash in lieu option. Whether that is a higher fee, as was mentioned, we tried to kind of fit it right in the middle of the range of what others charge. But as a last resort, the fee is helpful for administration. But it could be made significantly higher, or try to just keep it in line with what others are doing as it is written today.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. I prefer no cash in lieu if possible. I understand that there might be those times at which we might need that, but I think that maybe if that is considered as a last resort, then I guess I am okay with that. I do think that market rate per caliber inch, it does seem low, and it probably should be significantly higher, double and maybe even a little bit more than that. So that we aren't encouraging that route to just go with the cash in lieu, because as we know, that cash in lieu will come in, and then by the time it's spent, that won't cover the costs for what that tree will need to be covered. So would want to make sure that if we are going to go with that cash in lieu, that it is raised to ensure that we are getting quality product down the road. One of the projects that was mentioned in the council memo was the Broomfield Town Square. Will this project fall? And I will say that there was a lot of council and staff discussion as well as community discussion about trees within this project. Will this project fall under the new preservation code?
Thank you for the opportunity to clarify. There are a few existing projects that have existing development plans, development agreements, site development plans that have specific tree preservation requirements, and those will not be impacted by this code. This would be for new projects moving forward through the project process. But it was the experience with those projects that really led staff to bringing this forward and feeling like we need to have a standard requirement that we can apply across the board to all developments as they're moving forward, and establish what those requirements should be for all developments.
Okay. And because there was kind of this view of that there was a lot of learning experience that happened with the BTS project, can you talk about what elements of this new preservation code will not be incorporated into that BTS project?
Councilmember, there are so many details in it. I would hate to misspeak for the record, but if I could follow up with you later, that would be great.
That'd be great. Thank you. I think that there was some confusion between evergreen versus deciduous trees and the way in which those are measured. Are these measured differently when it comes to whether it's the cash in lieu or the development community?
So in terms of evergreens, with talking with staff, the forestry department has kind of asked more that with evergreen trees, we do have it in there that they are to be replaced with deciduous trees to increase our deciduous tree canopy. To answer your question, yes, deciduous trees and evergreen trees are measured differently. Evergreens are typically measured by height. But there is an appraisal value and a measurement that can be used to kind of have them have equal weight so that there is a way to translate it into how many inches of deciduous tree would be required.
Okay, and so all of that nuance then is within the code.
Correct.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to make sure that that was all there. In section A1V, this is just something that stood out to me. I'm not an expert in this field at all, but I just wanted to point it out. It says nurserymen, and that seemed very general, very male gendered. And I didn't know if that was a common term within this field or if this is just kind of one of those terms that we've used for a long time because it was a male dominated profession. And if this is something, can we update this?
It is somewhat just kind of a general term that is used within the industry, but I can definitely look into seeing what we can do to update it.
Okay, excellent. So I think that, definitely this tree preservation code is needed. There's a lot of good things within this. I do think that the mitigation section gives me some pause. The on-site replacement should be the priority. And if not, then a public property benefiting the surrounding area, perhaps within a half mile or something like that. And again, with the cash in lieu being that the least preferred option. So I think that, that's kind of my hesitation is within that mitigation section, but the rest of it, I definitely do support. As for the follow-up question about the city projects being exempted from these requirements, I think that we should be beholden to those same standards that we're applying to the rest of the community.
Thank you.
That's all I have, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Leslie.
Thank you, Mayor. I wish I knew more about this subject. We take trees for granted. And particularly those of us from the east tend to think all trees from the east should be here as well. So I'm curious about the issue of indigenous trees and to what extent we're trying to be true to what has traditionally, I won't even say traditionally, what has just naturally been here. And I guess the question is, are we trying to abide by what is natural here, or are we open to any kind of a tree from wherever it might come just because it's a tree? I'd like to know more about, and this may not be the right forum for that, but perhaps some further discussion to help us better understand. I mean, evergreen trees were not traditionally on the Great Plains. Cottonwoods were, as I understand that a little bit. I know that there are some trees in Anthem Ranch that were planted that have quickly died. Because the developer put such and such a tree there that probably shouldn't have been there. So I just like for future discussion, more information about what is appropriate to be here versus just whatever, okay? Particularly on city property. Secondarily, I'm also unsure of the water impact. Trees can help bring water, but they also take a lot of water. Given the water situation that we face here in the West, I'd like to know more about, are there certain trees, like I understand cottonwood is a very thirsty tree and may not be always the most productive tree if we're trying to preserve water. So I'd like to know more about that down the line. I do agree with the concept. Preventive maintenance, I think, is a major thing we often overlook, and I think protecting what we do have is important. I agree with my colleagues about cash in lieu. I'd rather see a replacement, but where I'm going with this is what would the replacement be, right? Is it, if it's a willow there and it dies or is killed, do we put another willow or 4 willows or 18 willows? Given the, the circumference of the tree, et cetera. So again, I'm not asking you to answer those now, but I really would love to know more about those issues so we can make a more informed discussion about what would be best for Broomfield, obviously, but for the whole Front Range.
So I can actually answer it to an extent.
Okay.
As part of the landscape code that was brought into effect last year, I also put together an approved water-wise plant list. And within that plant list, it does list out approved trees within Broomfield that also have categories, whether or not they're low water requirement or if they are native. So in terms of the replacement trees that will need to go in, they do need to come from that list. So that does kind of address some of what your concern was. The other thing that is also a little bit more in the code and not so much in my presentation is there is a ranking of the trees and their value. So if it were a willow that has a certain value within the arborist ratings, so other trees of that same value, but not necessarily the same variety, could be installed instead of a willow if that's not the end result that we're looking for.
Okay. Would you be kind enough to make available the access, the URL or whatever to that list? So we could see that? But I remember one of the developers over Baseline was talking about lining up a whole walkway with cottonwoods, and it just concerned me. And I asked a question about it, and his answer was, well, our arborist said it's this kind of cottonwood because this kind of cottonwood doesn't take as much water as that kind of cottonwood. And of course, I get left behind when it comes to that level of discussion, but we've got to balance this whole thing out. And I'd just like to know that we're replacing trees, if we are going to do that, that are the right ones, that are the appropriate ones, that are going to be more likely to survive here and be more beneficial to air quality, not necessarily taking away our water. It's that kind of thing. So I guess we have to turn, to you to help with that. I have one more question, and I don't know, City Manager, who can answer it, but I'm curious about our current budget for trees, what it is and how it's primarily utilized.
We're gonna have to get back to you on that. I don't have it
Sure.
at my fingertips.
Sure.
Um,
And I guess part of my question leads to whether or not we could reduce that budget through this process by having those responsible replace the trees rather than city having to come back and put trees in and, out of our current or future budget.
Ms. Bertanzetti, so I'm gonna look to you for two things. One, please briefly talk about if it's a city project. So we don't want to be paying ourselves under this guise, moving money from one fund to another fund when we're talking about cash in lieu and or administrative and or if we can't find the trees. And additionally, how do we determine short-term and long-term for city projects, what that replacement methodology is?
Okay, I've got a few questions, try to tackle a few of them. So the original question in terms of for our city projects, and it really was included in SMAC's presentation, was really the big question of how or should city projects be exempted. And I want to clarify that we're not proposing, staff is not saying, because we don't want to preserve trees as part of our projects. The capital projects team does a great job already of doing tree preservation, and they very carefully evaluate our projects, try to maximize the tree preservation where we can, our native landscapes where we can, whether it's trees or otherwise. And try to replan the landscaping as it's appropriate around areas. And I think the example we gave in the memorandum was the Sienna Reservoir project, where because of the amount of impact for installing the infrastructure, there were over 500 inches of trees that were impacted. And we were only able to fit a certain number back in because of the infrastructure that we were installing, which left us with a deficit. And if we had to do a cash in lieu and pay from the capital projects to the parks team, it would have been like an $80,000 impact. And then the parks team would have had to use that $80,000 to then go through their prioritization list and work on where those trees, that money could be spent to improve trees. And all that's to say, it wouldn't change the way that the capital projects teams approach that project, because we already try to maximize the preservation and plant very logically. Hopefully that's reflected in the plans that you're seeing come before you. So we don't believe that we need the tree preservation plan for our own projects. But there is the question of if there are impacted trees, and that's could happen with infrastructure projects like Sienna or right-of-way projects where we have to remove trees in order to make improvements to our necessary roadways. There will be trees that have to be removed. There isn't available space within our existing property with that project to replace it there. And we'd be left with having to do a cash in lieu. And if that is an option, should Brimfield have to budget that as part of a capital project and then transfer those funds over to parks to utilize for future parks projects, we're really then handing money from one end to the other. Or does city council want to direct staff to restructure the ordinance such that the capital projects would continue to utilize our existing processes in place, really that are being set up by those that are drafting this ordinance, and then exempt the projects because of the fact that they are primarily infrastructure projects and are utilizing city funds and try to prevent the payment from one division to another. And then I think you had a second question. I'm not sure if I hit it with my explanation, but let me know if I didn't.
I was so taken with the first answer
Okay.
that
We'll take it.
Budget. We'll have to get back to you on the budget.
Sure.
I can tell you that Kate Mack is an addition to our team. And I would very much like to hook Councilmember Delgadillo after her exciting conference on urbanism. Urban design is vastly different than anything that we've ever had here in Broomfield. We've been looking for a urban design planner. We just didn't know what to do with them. So the fact that we just heard about biophilia, which I'm gonna say that word at least 10 times this week. So I'm gonna count that as one, Ms. Mack. But the expertise that she brings, again, is something that will become ever increasing as we talk about anything having to do with density. So Ms. Mack, I don't even remember what the second question was, but we're so happy to have you adding such great value to these plans as we move forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just trying to, I thank you for that. I appreciate that very much. I'm just trying to get, again, a broader understanding of the current budget, how it's spent, and how might this affect that budget. I appreciated the further explanation around the cash in lieu issue and whether certain projects might require us, transfer money or something. I mean, there may also be the issue that we don't need any more trees in a certain area. I don't know if we're trying to forest everything, but that urban issue becomes, I think, very important for us. So these are just more complex issues that come out of what you're posing for us, which is very important, and I appreciate it very much. But I'd just like to know more and have access, I guess, to more information before, I know you want to move to readings and things, and certainly we want to help accommodate your time frame. But at least for me, it would help to have a little bit more information. So I appreciate that very much. I just bought a book called Be a Tree. And it's a kind of a leadership book about different species of trees and their primary kind of modality, like aspen or community. So be more community is that kind of the thing. So I'll share the link back to you if you'll share your link with me, okay?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next is Councilmember Marshallson.
Thank you, Mayor. Pretty much everything I've wanted to say was just covered by Councilmember Leslie and Schaaf, Mayor Pro Tem Schaaf. I appreciate all this. This is great. I love everything about it. The one thing that gives me pause is the cash in lieu, like has been said. Here's a procedural question. Is this tree plan going to be part of the site development plans that we're presented with in the approval process? When is this going to be presented?
Yeah, my intent is to have it as part of the site development process. So that does come in early so that we can address any conflicts and kind of work through even different layout options in order to possibly like preserve a stand of trees.
Then my request would be that the cash in lieu payment, just so it's absolutely it's clear that it's the last option. I would think that should have to be a variance that's approved by council to allow the cash in lieu. At the very, I mean, I don't think, to my not thinking, there shouldn't be any option for the developer to be able to pay a cash in lieu. If that's not an option, in the draft ordinance where under I on page 6 and 7, where it lists out the alternatives to the relocation, it lists cash in lieu as one of those. If we could strengthen that, take that out of that list and say at the very, here's the options. And if none of those work, then you can pay a cash in lieu. That would be kind of my thought on that I would like to see it very clear to the developer that they can't pay the cash in lieu unless it's an absolute last resort. And then on the cash in lieu, I agree with Member Pro Tem Schaaf. I'm perfectly fine leading the market on this one and charging them an exorbitant fee to not tear down trees. So
Thank you for that.
that's it.
All right, Councilmember Lim.
Yes, I have the same hesitancy about the cash in lieu. So we'll see where that goes. My question about staff's concern about making the code apply strictly to the CIP projects. What happens if it's a CIP project that we have a contractor doing? If we exempt the city CIP projects from this code, then do we exempt that subcontractor from paying the replacement damages?
Thank you for the opportunity to clarify that, because we do have the separate contract with our contractor and can work in penalties within our contracts, first of all. But then just these are practices that we can put in place for our own projects and enforce with our contractors through separate mechanisms, because we have agreements with these contractors to have them be responsible for any penalties. But realistically, then that's instead of being the project paying for penalties related to not being able to replace enough trees, that is then that our contractor is not performing, and we can look at how that could potentially be added to specific contracts as necessary. But I do want to clarify that we're not saying that we don't want to follow these best practices with our contractors. It's just these are what we believe are appropriate, and we control our own projects even when we hire a third party to do the work.
So you're going to take, basically, you're going to take whatever this code is. If we choose not to apply this code to our own CIP projects, you're just going to take this code and insert it into a contractor's contract? Is
Not
that
quite. Sorry, in relation to the penalty, if they made if someone didn't protect trees as required and damage occurred to a tree and it's the fault of the contractor, that portion of this requirement could be in a contract with those doing the work. But the rest of, there's a lot of requirements in this tree preservation code in terms of replacement trees, the preservation, and some of it is very challenging for us with an infrastructure project because the road has to go where the road has to go, or large reservoirs will impact significant areas, and we will have limited then area left for replanting the trees. So it's those portions of the code that we would find very challenging for infrastructure and capital projects to be able to apply to our own projects. But in terms of best practices, we would still be able to do that. Or if there is negligence on behalf of our contractors and damage occurred, that's something we could handle separately.
Okay. Would it, my tendency is to agree with a few other of my council counterparts who said, yes, it should apply to the city too. It just seems incongruous to me to implement a code that we wouldn't have to follow in this regard. So is it possible that, this is out of the box, could we make the code apply to us, but not make us pay the fine? Would that make any sense?
Yes, I think I understand where you're coming from. I think a little bit of it might come with how we structure the ordinance itself and the language. If council's direction is that it would be okay to proceed with including language that addressed infrastructure projects and significant capital improvements may not be able to follow the replacement requirements. And we can list out the areas that we find might be the most challenging for our capital projects team to be able to meet, and the cash in lieu payment for not being able to replace trees on site, those types of things, while still ensuring that there is the best practices in terms of tree protection would still apply, and some of those other elements, replacing trees with appropriate trees from the tree list, those things that we would do anyway, and making sure that it's clear to the community that we're not trying to exempt our projects and we're out there doing things that are not consistent with what we've drafted here. But we just, for the sake of clarification, I think it might be in the nuance of how the language gets drafted. And that might be really on us to bring forward a more clear understanding with the first reading of how that could be structured. And I'd like to take an opportunity, if I can, to go back to one of the points that Councilmember Marsh-Fulshin had mentioned in terms of requesting a variance for the cash in lieu or council approval, which sounds a little bit similar to how we do the agreements with inclusionary housing, how it was originally drafted. So I think that that also could be something that we could look at.
Okay. There was a question in the memo about, should we cap the number of trees that would be required to be replaced? Can you explain where that question was coming from? And then, yeah, go ahead.
So that actually does stem from Fort Collins and their tree preservation code. So it has more to do with the removal of larger trees. So say you removed a 36-inch diameter tree, that would be 18 2-inch trees that would have to replace it. So in their code, it's written that instead of there being 18, that would just be reduced down to 6 trees for that particular tree replacement.
Okay. I wanted to hear the explanation, but my reaction is still the same. No, no. Make them, I mean, they should not, they should, if they remove a 36-inch tree, that's a big problem. So they should replace it with whatever the equivalent would be. So that would be my response to that question in there. Okay, thanks.
All right, Councilmember Nguyen.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm just gonna be very brief. Again, I support this ordinance change just because, as we heard earlier from the Open Trails Advisory Committee, this is gonna help Broomfield be more green, be more environmental friendly, and be more beautiful. So I don't have any issues at all. I think I have some reservations with reading about the memo on the town square of, because I know we're probably gonna be developing that or starting the construction soon. So I guess my question is, would the tree removal process start during this or immediately after the ordinance is passed, or how would that affect the town square project?
You, Councilmember. Because the Broomfield Town Square already has a site development plan approved and their development agreement is approved, the timing for the adoption of this particular ordinance wouldn't impact them. They'd be able to proceed under their existing agreements that they have in place.
Cool. That's all I have. Thank you so much again, and I appreciate the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Ward.
Thank you, Mayor. I will also keep it brief as well. I support the proposal. I do not think we should exempt Broomfield projects from the standards, other than I would be comfortable in finding some workaround for the cash in lieu, whether that be a full exemption or we do something else, but that's what I have to say on that.
Thank you. Councilmember Cohen.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll be quick. I just wanted to clarify on the issue. I guess my question is, if the tree is old and it's not, how do you determine whether it's worth, I mean, it's, some trees are about to fall over versus they still have a lifespan. Are you able to determine like, well, these 6 trees could still live 20 years, therefore it has value, but this one may not survive a year or 3 years? You put that in the value.
That is what the condition rating is for with the 1 to 6. It does, having it just described as the 1 to 6 is oversimplifying it. There's actually further characteristics for each of the ratings that do actually address that in terms of, you know, a tree rating of a 6 is typically a dead tree. Tree rating of a 5 is something that probably may only have 10% signs of life that is still remaining. And those 2 values of trees are actually not required for replacement.
Okay. So if there's a scenario of the development, and there's 6 trees and 3 of them, but they're mature, the 30-year-old trees, if they're not healthy, we don't require the replacement if we determine that. Or we could require them a certain multiplier effect to replace them with more trees.
Correct. So
Right.
it will come down to the overall general condition rating that they are given.
Okay. And I had a quick question on the exemption of Broomfield. Does that affect all public agencies, or we're just talking about ourselves? Department of Transportation. Well, I'm also thinking of and I think this is us, but the stormwater project in Ward 1, I think has dozens of trees that'll probably be taken down for that project.
At first I was like, oh no, we were only really talking about our own capital projects, but then I thought, oh, you do bring up a very good point. So that is something that we probably should look at when we really start to further define the ordinance, and that's something we'll make sure to address before we bring it back for first reading.
And just to the stormwater project, if we exempt, I don't know what the one that's along 120th, I think there's dozens of trees that will have to be replaced or something on that.
Dennison Channel.
Yeah. That would be impacted by this unless we exempt ourselves.
Correct. So all projects would be required to comply. So in that instance, it's unlikely that, given the narrow scope of the channel, that they'd be able to replant the trees within the channel, because of course that's against the purpose of the improvements. So then it would be probably a significant cash in lieu payment that project would need to budget for and provide to Broomfield.
And lastly, real quick on the cash in lieu, I think the issue was brought up, was suggested that if the cash in lieu is not of a significant size, it's an easy out for developers just to go, oh, I'll pay that and move on. So I don't know, I think the comment was made, we just chose one in the middle, but I'd be interested in whether the higher rates are more effective, that it does prevent the developers from just taking the easy out rather than just picking one in the middle. So I would be supportive of a cash in lieu, but at a effective rate, shall we say. Thank you, that's all.
All right, thank you. Is there any other council member questions or comments? Well, thank you so much for bringing this forward. Do you have a clear feedback and direction for the next steps?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mack, and thank you, Ms. Burton-Zetti. We're going to go ahead and take our 10-minute break. It's 8:08. We'll be back at 8:18. Thank you. Welcome back to part 2 of our study session. Our next study session item this evening is an update regarding low-density residential lot and house size requirements. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, and I'll ask our staff to summarize.
Anna Bertonzetti, part 3. Ms. Bertonzetti.
Thank you. The last item for community development this evening, as you mentioned, is a potential update bringing forward for the R1 district as well as low-density residential development in planned unit development districts. If I could have the next slide. So this study session is actually a follow-up from an initial study session that we did in January of this year where we talked about potential updates to residential development standards. So this is the first one we're bringing forward. Tonight's discussion, again, is just about the R1 district. And this would really apply to properties that already have R1 zoning, any future projects that occur in R1 zoning, and it can apply to existing homes in the R1 district. And I'll explain a little bit about how this could impact those homeowners. Changes are also included in tonight's discussion regarding potentially removing the uniform standards that are included for low density residential and really any of the densities in the planned unit development zone properties. So that change would only impact undeveloped properties that are zoned PUD that do not already have a PUD plan and site development plan in place. So we're not proposing any changes to existing PUD plans and site development plans. And really for any homeowner who owns a property that's zoned PUD, their setbacks are established in those site development plans. And we're not proposing any changes to that this evening. So again, in terms of what we're bringing forward tonight, it would really be the intent is to potentially provide an increase in density as well as some new development opportunities within the R1 districts that are within Broomfield. And this would be done by reducing minimum lot sizes, reducing minimum setbacks, and potentially reducing minimum floor areas for new homes. Next slide, please. As we responded to council direction and began drafting this potential update, we considered some of the recent subdivisions that have been before council in recent years. Subdivisions in recent years have included generally smaller single-family subdivisions than what historically had been in place in Broomfield. So generally what we saw was around a movement from 7,000 square feet being a minimum in most neighborhoods to 5,000 square feet or so being about the new minimum. So applying this reduced setback through all of existing properties that are zoned R1 could potentially create some limited opportunities for infill. So if a homeowner owned a property or a property owner, could be a vacant piece of property, owned a property that was zoned R1 and had more than 10,000 square feet, so an oversized lot, potentially there could be an opportunity for subdividing that lot. We think it would be pretty limited because a lot of our oversized lots are actually irregularly shaped. So the lot has to be so configured that you could actually meet the minimum lot width and the area as well. So have 2 developable 5,000 square foot lots. And also because on a lot of oversized lots, the existing home isn't placed to one side or the other of the lot. It's usually placed generally centralized, which then creates an issue with potentially trying to subdivide that lot. So there could be situations, limited situations, where there's an opportunity to create an infill in an existing subdivision, but we believe this would be limited. The more likely scenario of how this potential update that's being discussed tonight could impact existing homeowners would be through the decrease in setbacks that would be applicable for all existing R1 districts. So this could potentially create an opportunity for homeowners to reinvest in their properties through an expansion of their existing house footprint because the reduced setbacks could provide for additional opportunity to the side or to the front or rear of their existing home. Next slide, please. So this slide is a little hard to read on the screen, but it's also produced as a link in the memorandum. It might be better viewed there, but what we were trying to provide was an overview of what the R1 district currently provides in terms of its minimum square footage and setbacks, what the low density uniform standard is for future PUD plans, and then also 5 or 6 existing home subdivisions that have recently been approved in Broomfield. So as you can see, Dillon Point has some lots that are down to 4,000 square feet, but 5,000 is more common with some of the areas in Skystone. with a 6,000 square foot minimum. And generally, the setbacks were reduced to 5 feet on the side, 15 feet in the rear, and between 15 and 20 in the front of the home. So in terms of the PUD standards and the uniform standards that were adopted as part of the code a number of years ago, the last subdivisions that we can see that were really significant builds in Brimfield that followed the the uniform standards that are in the code were really Wildgrass and Anthem. And after that time, Brimfield really started to look at a more narrow lot, smaller lots, and trying to diversify our housing options. And so we have the housing needs assessment that's been cited by a number of developers as they brought projects forward to justify going to a smaller lot size, trying to think about providing more opportunities for different types of residential subdivisions. And that's what we're seeing today. Next slide, please. So staff prepared what is before you this evening for discussion that could be a potential update to the R1 standards. To start with, it would reduce the minimum lot size in R1 zoned properties from 7,000 square feet to 5,000 square feet. It'd reduce the side yard setbacks to 5 feet on either side, except the corner lots would have a wider setback of 15 feet. Setbacks for the front and rear of the house would be reduced from 25 feet down to 15 feet, but there would need to be language included to ensure that the garage face was at least 20 feet from the front property line to make sure that we could fit a vehicle in the driveway without blocking a public sidewalk. In standard R1 districts, there is an allowance in the municipal code for decks, garages, carports, and porches to encroach already into the rear and front yard setbacks by up to 6 feet. So in that 25 feet that's listed in the code, already by the municipal code, we allow up to 6 feet for carports, garages, and porches to encroach into that distance. Staff believes that if we were to move forward with an amendment to change the minimum setbacks to only 15 feet, it would be appropriate to then not allow any further encroachment into that 15 feet. So the difference, for example, for a porch would be moving from what had been a 6-foot encroachment to now it would be a 10-foot difference. So no reason to further encroach into what's remaining in the 15 feet. So there might be some other additional areas of the municipal code we'll verify with to make sure that any other encroachment language we make sure is consistent as we move forward with drafting. One benefit of the change, as we've outlined it this evening, is you can see in the existing R1 district, there's kind of a complicated methodology for how to determine your side yard setback. And we run into a lot of issues when we're reviewing permits for people with existing homes, because it looks like they should have a 5-yard side yard setback requirement. But what's in the fine print is that they actually also have to have at least 15 feet between their structure and the next adjacent structure on the adjacent lot. And it can be very frustrating for homeowners to find out that what they thought was a 5-foot setback is now actually a 10-foot setback because their neighbor built their house 5 feet from the property line. We have a number of non-conforming neighborhoods in Brimfield where R1 district homes were built before this requirement became a requirement. So there's 5 feet built on either side of the homes, and it can be a little bit problematic. We actually just had a case go to the Neighborhood Board of Adjustment for something very similar. And the Neighborhood Board of Adjustment granted the homeowner a variance to be able to go down to 5 feet instead of having to comply with that 15-foot separation. But generally, it would create more streamlined administration of that setback, a more clear understanding for homeowners that the side yard setback could be 5 feet on either side, and they're not dependent on where their adjacent homeowner has a structure on their adjacent lot. Additionally, as previously mentioned, staff is recommending that the uniform standards that are contained in the PUD zone section of the municipal code also be removed. Those uniform standards were added to the code to provide, with the intent of providing uniformity in future PUD plans as they were considered by City Council. So PUD plans and site development plans still include final setbacks within their documentation that was approved by the City Council. The uniform standards were just intended to be a starting point as a minimum. However, It should be noted, this is counter to really the purpose of PUD plans, which is intended to be more customized zoning, not uniform. And it's also creates a situation where Brimfield it has more uniform development across the city, even within PUD districts. And Brimfield has been moving away from that in response to our housing needs analysis and the intent to provide more diversity in our housing options. So at this point, staff is recommending that those uniform standards be removed from the municipal code in terms of a starting basis for PUD plans. And instead, we would consider the customized zoning district requirements as part of each PUD plan. And as part of the memorandums that staff brings forward, we can provide a comparison to other zoning districts and to other subdivisions, but not be directing developers to follow a strict uniform standard as they move forward. Next slide, please. So there's a few other changes that we had incorporated in the discussion for this evening. One is to reduce the home size from 950 feet to 800 feet. It's not a significant move. I don't know that this will have a significant impact on Brimfield. A lot of our homes that we have constructed currently far exceed 950 square feet, but it does provide an additional option. After looking at some of the tiny home requirements, we really feel like moving the minimum house size from 950 feet down to something like 400 square feet, which is more consistent with tiny homes, really still won't fully address achieving tiny home communities, because tiny home developments typically also have significantly smaller lot sizes. They might have cluster type developments where they don't have, a garage at each location. It's very unique standards. The setbacks are different. We really feel like that is really the intent of a PUD, is to address those types of unique developments where we would need to look at unique standards to create a tiny home community. So we didn't move it all the way to 400 square feet because we think that's unlikely on a 5,000 square foot lot. Or any of our other lots that we will be coming forward in the middle housing discussion later this year. But we did propose dropping that to 800 square feet, but would be open to City Council's direction if there was a direction to move that further lower. And then the second one I already discussed, which was the uniform subdivision standards. Next slide, please. So we're really looking for a couple pieces of direction. We didn't draft the ordinance for this evening. We would bring that back for your consideration. But we wanted to know whether council was interested in proceeding with a change that could impact the existing R1 district. And if yes, is 5,000 square feet a good place to start? And if yes, are the setbacks as proposed by staff, again, a good place to start? And then would council like to bring back an ordinance to remove the uniform standards from the PUD districts, and whether the reduction in the minimum home size from 950 feet to 800 feet was appropriate, or whether you would be either not interested in doing that or more interested in having a further reduction. And that concludes staff's presentation on this particular item.
Thank you, Ms. Burton-Fetty. And we'll now go to questions from council. Any questions from council? Councilmember Leslie.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for your presentation. There's a lot here. You know what I'd really love to do, rather than give you an answer tonight, you're asking whether you should go and begin community engagement. I'd really like you to do that, and then to feed back to us what you're hearing from your community discussions. I think that would help me anyway get some feel for what the community would like to see in these regards. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Councilmember Marshall-Shin.
Thank you, Mayor. Quick question. In the previous study session on this subject, there was some talk about also allowing multiplexes in R1 districts. Is that something that we're not moving forward at this time?
Thank you for that, Councilmember Marshall-Shin. So we did discuss that during the January study session, whether to remove really the allowance for a single family zone district. And what staff presented in January was that is a very big discussion that we think deserves a separate conversation. So we will bring that back for a separate study session at a later time. But we don't have the capacity to take that on this year, probably.
Fair enough. I do look forward to that discussion. I don't disagree with Councilmember Leslie's desire to see public engagement on this. I do think that's important, and any discussion we need has to have that. Right now, I do support everything that you've proposed. I would also support going further if necessary, especially on the single-family home size, to allow more tiny homes possibly. And I think the setbacks they're okay. I was looking at the PUD for my neighborhood, because wife and I talked about remodeling, and we got the zoning documents from the staff, and so in Brandywine, the setbacks are even less than what they are in this proposal. So I'm okay with going further lower down if we need to. For example, my side, I have a 5-foot setback, but only 10 feet from the adjacent house. So maybe something like that. Of course, I also have an 8-foot so yeah, I'm okay with what staff has recommended. I'd like to go further if we could, maybe smaller. So that's my thoughts for right now.
Councilmember Ward.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate that we are going through this process of reducing our lot sizes. Increased lot sizes do bring increased costs for bigger homes, which means more expensive homes. However, I don't think this is enough. I would like to see an even lower, smaller amount for the minimum area. I would like to see lower lot widths. Anything that would allow a larger amount of density while also reducing the size of some homes, because not everyone needs a very large single-family home on a 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 square foot area. I think some seniors, for example, would like to downsize to and keep a single-family type style home, but not have the same maintenance associated with having such a large lot size.
Councilmember Ward, if I could use this as a good opportunity, I really neglected to say we kind of mentioned it in January, but this is going to come forward in a number of phases. And the next study session on this topic, it's kind of a race between two. But the next one I think you'll see is middle housing. So that will get a little bit to some additional housing options and much smaller lot sizes than what we have. I will say we were trying to strike a balance between honoring the existing neighborhoods that are in Broomfield that are R1, and trying to make sure that we are not being too drastic in changes that could change the character of those neighborhoods, while still understanding we want to try and allow for some densification within the neighborhood. So trying to strike that balance, and we will be including community engagement if council directs us to move forward this evening. But it sounds like what we will bring forward probably later this summer, early fall might be of interest. That'll be what we call middle housing, addressing the R6, 7 districts in Broomfield.
I appreciate that answer. I think both can happen at the same time, including going with much smaller lot size requirements, particularly for new developments that are going forward. But that's all I have to say. Thank you.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Councilmember Lim.
I'm fine with the staff going forward with those parameters for the beginning of the conversation with the stakeholders. My question was, when we were discussing that whole package of possible changes in January, we didn't know what was going to happen at the state legislature. Now we do. So for better or worse, where does that mandate in the future for rezoning fit into what we're doing now? Or should we be waiting or in doing the state mandate?
We have a number of items that we're bringing forward. This particular item with the R1 as well as the R3, R6 districts. Trying to remember all of our numbering system, but the middle housing that we'll see this summer, both ended up, they are at a low enough density, we probably will not be able to utilize them in any of the districts that will be looking to address density in terms of House Bill 1313. So those will primarily be addressed with our mixed use district that you will also be seeing later this year. We will potentially be planning a study session to talk about 1313, probably after DOLA is able to publish their guidelines for us. But there will be a separate discussion independent from some of these other projects or initiatives that we have moving forward. But we do have others that could potentially be impacted by recent legislation. Starting next month, you'll be looking at some parking study updates, and we'll be addressing how recent state legislative changes could impact ordinances that we bring forward in relation to parking. So we are trying to incorporate them as we move along. But in terms of recent changes for the R1 district, it doesn't impact this one, but we will be, you'll all be seeing me a few times for ordinances over the next year with things that are, in response to the legislative session.
With 1313, that, I think that has an implementation date of like 2027. Is it that far out? Okay.
Yes.
So, but you're planning that we would be starting to talk about those efforts for rezoning towards 1313 already this year.
Probably not looking at the rezonings this year. We would like to see, so DOLA is required. I believe the final dates were in February or March of next year. They have until to give us guidelines for doing the assessment of our transit-oriented communities. So we'd like to see what DOLA provides in terms of that guidance before we make any initiatives to contact property owners to talk to them about rezoning their properties or amending their PUD plan. So we'd like to see that guidance from DOLA, the specifics of it, revisit with City Council on the direction that we think we need to go in order to comply. And then, as you mentioned, we have until June of 2027 to actually come into compliance with what's determined to be our housing opportunity goal.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Cohen.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to drill down on one question, which is infill. Because I could see this could create conflict with existing communities, existing neighborhoods, where someone could come in and plop down a very dense neighborhood right up against existing, or someone could buy up a block of houses. And I assume under this could then put in very dense housing. What's the thought there, or what concerns that might create?
So those are concerns that communities have to weigh when we're looking at modifying existing zone districts. So this does impact existing homeowners, existing property owners that already have R1. So there, as I mentioned, there are limited opportunities probably within those neighborhoods with an existing lot already being oversized and being able to squeeze in an additional lot without removing. But other communities do have experiences where someone buys a block of homes and redevelops. I'm not sure the financial balance works here yet, but potentially it could in the future. We also have some areas of Brimfield, like the Brimfield Heights Filing 1 neighborhood, that does have a neighborhood overlay already that would prevent that from occurring because there are limitations in how some neighborhoods are able to develop already because of their zoning. So there's other development standards or design standards built into the zoning. So if it became a concern, that would be another tool that Brimfield could utilize sometime in the future if we were feeling there was a lot of development pressure and the community was not happy with the direction that that was taking. They could look at additional overlays to address that concern.
Okay, so like for instance, Westlake, I could see that happening. If you're on that street, there's no recourse necessarily if you're a neighbor. There's no rezone. It's just a allowed zoning or allowed use. that
So
way.
Westlake is a PUD,
The
so
whole
they
thing?
would,
I
the whole
thought-
thing.
Oh, okay. I was
So
thinking-
there are some existing pockets within Westlake that are going through a process to rezone or to adopt their PUD plan. So the impact there would be that the new projects wouldn't have uniform standards to rely on. But in transparency, no recent project has followed those uniform standards. So it wouldn't be atypical for a project to come forward and not follow the uniform standards.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Delgadillo.
Thank you, Mayor. So I am very supportive of this. This seems like a great way to add some gentle density. It allows for more flexibility for us to respond to market demands. And given that, I'd be very open to going even further when it comes to lot size, house size, and setbacks, because it doesn't guarantee that that's going to happen. It just takes away an additional barrier for developers. I think another thing I want to point out is that this allows us to house more people per acre of infrastructure, which especially now as we're thinking about the costs of maintenance, this is a great thing for us to consider of how we can do more with less and how we can make sure that we're fiscally sustainable going forward. The other thing I do want to say is I want to second the thought that housing diversity is really important. It provides different houses for different stages in life, maybe for that starter home and maybe for that person downsizing as a senior. The other thing I do kind of want to note is about market demand. So also at my urbanism conference, there was someone who was doing some incremental development. There's an incremental development alliance, people doing infill development. And typically those people, I mean, they are tied to a balance sheet. These are small developers buying up small lots. And a lot of the most common thing I saw was there was this presenter from Duncanville, Texas. Duncanville has a population of 39,000 people, so it's much, much smaller than we are. And lots of what they do, if they do any kind of modifications to a single family home, it's typically to rent out individual rooms. So very gentle, very small amounts of density. Because again, us being even larger than Duncanville, the market does not demand a quadplex. The market does not demand this incredible tall development or anything like that. So I am personally not concerned about that. I think maybe if one day Broomfield's the hot spot instead of Boulder or Denver in 100 years, I'm sure there will be a different council having a very different discussion, but I did want to add that note as well. So yes, I love this. I would love to go even further, but I'm very supportive of this as it is. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go to Councilmember Nguyen next because Councilmember Leslie already spoke once. So we're going to go through the first round and then we'll go second round, Councilmember Leslie. So Councilmember Nguyen, you're next.
Thank you, Mayor. Similar to my fellow other council members has mentioned, I am greatly in support of this as it gives options for, folks to build more homes, to either, give an option to not expand, but like to find a home that fits their preference. And so for the questions that are before us, support for 5,000 square minimum lot, yes. Reduce setbacks proposed, yes. Would to basically create an ordinance that would remove the uniform subdivision standards in PUD, yes. And would the council like to support community engagement and bring back an ordinance of consideration of 950 square feet to 800 square feet? Yes, just because, these are ways we can mitigate, give opportunities for more homes. And again, we want to see Broomfield grow, but also not force people to leave Broomfield. So I think this is a good opportunity for density, and I appreciate the presentation. Thank you.
And Councilmember Henkel.
Thank you, Mayor. I do support, more density and the concept behind it, and I would like to have more community engagement. I believe I've asked this question before, but I'm just curious if we've talked about what this does to insurance rates. I know that we have had people, I think even come to the podium talking about how, higher density or houses being closer together is going to raise due to the Marshall fires in the areas with housing insurance even going up as it is. I'm just curious as to if we've done that homework yet or had that discussion.
And we have not done that level of research, but I will say that was one of the driving factors for keeping it at a 5-foot separation, is that is the separation needed for the building code. It's a minimum for having to meet fire rating for the wall. So anything less than that, and it changes the way that you have to construct the wall of the whatever it is that you're building, the home, the ADU, the shed. So we did use that a little bit as a guidance. It's not considered a high density like we have in some of our areas where there's only a 3-foot separation between some low or what I would call low density homes because they're separated. But we do have some areas where it's only 3 feet on either side of the property line. So there's only 6 feet of total separation between wall to the homes. That would potentially be something that I'm not sure what the impact would be to insurance. But 5 feet is pretty standard. It's not anything unusual. So we can ask around. I'm not sure how much research or data we'd be able to get for you, but we can definitely ask a few questions and see if it raises any flags.
Yeah, I think if we're going to require sprinkler systems inside homes, particularly for single family homes, that we should consider that when we talk about density for safety reasons. And if you're around an area where you have more of a high risk for fire, I think that should be something to be considered. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Schaaf.
Thank you, Mayor. So in case I missed a yes from Councilmember Nguyen, mine is yes times 5.
All right, and back to Councilmember Leslie. You had,
No, I cleared my cache from before.
would you like to speak again?
No, thank you.
Okay, just checking. Anyone else? Any other questions or comments? Well, right on. So, Ms. Burton-Zetti, does that do it for you? Excellent. Well, thank you all. Our final study session item this evening is a discussion on timing for potential ballot questions regarding charter changes. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, and I'll ask our staff to begin the discussion. Ms. Rogers.
Mayor, would you mind if I stayed here?
No, stay
Okay.
there.
I just have my whole
Please
setup.
do.
It tends to be a little easier. All right. Thank you for, this is now our 3rd study session and sort of the culmination of the discussions we've had about the charter changes up to this point. I am going to, just because I want these meetings to have a summary for anybody watching them for the first time, go through how we got to the point tonight. Next slide. So we haven't had a comprehensive review of the charter actually since 1974. A lot of changes, a lot of reviews, but not a comprehensive review. Council got a charter review committee together made up of 5 residents and 2 council members who went through the entire charter and recommended changes. These study sessions that we've had, council has discussed not only those recommendations from the Charter Review Committee, but other suggestions that council had as far as changes to the charter. In the last couple study sessions, council has narrowed down sort of the ones that are viable questions, things that could move forward, concepts that they support. And now tonight, we're going to be talking about the timing. The way ballot questions work, they would be put in ordinance form. So nothing is voted on tonight. That's sort of been the theme of all the study sessions. There would be a first reading, a second reading, and a public hearing. And then ultimately the voters have the decision on any charter changes. Next slide. A full list of the changes for those listening are in the staff memo, and they go section by section, and the charter in its entirety can be found on our website. Next slide. As I mentioned, charter questions have to be in ordinance format. So that takes 2 more public meetings. So there's a lot of opportunity for the public to engage on these issues should they wish. If they're approved, the questions put on the ballot. If the voters approve, the question, then it goes into effect immediately unless there's some different date that was in the ballot question. Next slide. Again, nothing is voted on tonight. There'll be more public meetings, more chances for public comment, and of course, the voters have the ultimate approval. Next slide. A couple of reminders for council and for the public listening. So after the ballot question is approved, government funds and resources may not be used to support or oppose any ballot questions. So Broomfield letterhead, Broomfield emails, using meeting time, staff knocking door to door. That's not permitted. Us as individuals and you as elected officials as individuals can support or oppose a ballot question as you see fit, as can the residents. Single subject, all ordinances must be combined to single subject, a little bit different than the rule that is going on, the application of the rule that's going on in the state right now, but our ordinances must be a single subject. So we're going to talk about grouping tonight. You can group some questions together, but really if you have a question where, and I pulled up something from a case that, you know, if the question has at least two distinct and separate purposes that each independently could survive on their own, then it probably should be two different questions. So we'll talk about that as we talk about grouping questions together. Council could consider a full repeal and reenact. That needs a 2/3 majority of council to approve a repeal ordinance. Can you go to 2 slides forward? Thanks, Curtis. Yeah, that one. So our next step in this process is timing and answering the questions of what questions, including none, will be presented to the voters in 2024. We'll talk about ballot fatigue. I know many of you are aware of how many questions are going to the ballot. And what questions could be deferred to future years. Conservatively, we have anywhere between 28 and 32 questions potentially to change the charter. So this could be, and I would advise that if council wants to make these changes, this would be a multi-year effort. So go back one more slide to the one before chart. Yeah. So some considerations I'd like council to think about is what changes are truly cleanup. And in the ballot question, we can tell the voters these are truly cleanup. They're not substantive. What changes should happen now? Ballot fatigue, as I already mentioned. What changes impact a Broomfield election and potentially should be on an odd number rather than an even number year, or maybe an even number year so we have 2 years to get ready for implementation. What changes don't need to be made immediately or at all? Council's consensus was to not make any changes on Chapter 20, which is the fracking initiative that was approved by the voters, even though by its own terms it's expired, but there's no need to make that change. So that would be an example of that. And then what is or could be covered by council rules or other procedures or ordinances? Best example of this right now is third reading of ordinances. Council has already adopted that to their rules. So with that, I had linked in the packet and I had sent to council a chart. And Curtis, it's hyperlinked. Thank you. Guys are awesome. This is available to the public and it's also available to council. And it has each change grouped by chapter. You'll see a column for staff note and any preference. We did put our priority in there as if staff was going to make this determination. And then I had a column for you all to write your own priority or your own thoughts about this. With that, Mayor, that's the end of the presentation and we can have the discussion.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Rogers. Who would like to go first? And the focus is 5 is the sweet spot to move forward with this year. And Ms. Rogers, were you able to discern the very low priority items that we could?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
perfect.
So, you know, I know some of us have different views on different questions, so I don't mean to negate something that's important to you by saying this, but I do think that some of the lower priorities are like in chapter 2, section 2.1, which is adding a reference to the Broomfield Constitutional Amendment or saying that the charter controls if there's conflict. Those are legal realities. Our constitutional amendment controls no matter what. Charter controls over all of our other local laws. So to me, that's lowest priority because it doesn't really affect current operations. In section 6.5, we had an effective date and a severability clause. That's also sort of a legal construct. It's been established in case law. It cleans it up, but it's definitely a lower priority. You know, some of the posting locations, we wanted to update it so it didn't say municipal and gave staff a little more wiggle room. That's in chapter 12. I would say those are lowest priority, and the removal of the income tax.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We will start with Councilmember Marshall Olson.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to once again advocate that we do this as a repeal and reenactment with the exception of the term limit proposal. I think the term limit one is going to be something that's going to be very controversial for voters, and that's something that should be its own standalone discussion and debate. Everything else, to my mind, is not that controversial and pretty straightforward, and I think we should just do it all. I mean, talking about 30-something ballot measures over the course of what, 5-6 years, that seems to be not just voter fatigue of the voters, the voter fatigue of us, and trying to figure out which to do which year. It just doesn't make sense to me to go to all that work and all that staff time to do it every single year. We can just, most of these are just cleanups and can be done all at once, and just do a full repeal reenactment this year, except for the term limits. And if it fails, then we can always go back and piecemeal it going forward on the other ones. But I think that's the best use of staff and our time and the voters' time, just to do a pretty clean. That's what I'm advocating for. So that's my position. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Councilmember Cohen.
Thank you, Mayor. I wanted to ask for just a question from Mr. Rogers. It wasn't quite clear on the chart which one of these had to be an issue by itself versus ones that could be grouped. I don't know if there's a way of distinguishing, like, I think it was, you said 4.7 could all be one, and then there's other places where under chapter 6, they'd all have to be potentially separate. Is that what we're looking at?
Yeah, so I think chapter 4 is a great example, Councilmember Cohen, because, and in the gray line with the chapter, I do suggest separate questions. We can probably combine a couple of them, like potentially 4.2 and 4.6, because it has to go to mapping and how mapping impacts something. But ward mapping is very different than term limits and the term limit for the mayor. We might be able to combine term limits and a term for the mayor as 4. That's a little bit of a reach, right? Because they can independently survive together or survive separately. I do think all of 4.7, which addresses vacancies, that's the umbrella concept, is vacancies. And so all those things address vacancies. I think that's a little more defensible. So we're looking for either a good umbrella concept or how separate, if one fails, can the other survive if it passes, and vice versa.
So to Councilmember Marshall Olson's point, all these would be more than 12 potentially separate ballot measures. Somewhere in that neighborhood.
In chapter 4?
No,
or-
just the total, all the things that are on the chart. To do all of that would take about more than 12 ballot measures. Questions, I guess, is the issue.
Well, I do think chapter 3 in elections, that could be one question, because a question it would be, shall Title I control Broomfield's elections? And there's a lot of changes that are made to the language because of that, but that's the overarching concept. So it really does sort of go to how, some of our chapters have a lot of subjects in them and some of them are a little more defined. So There is I mean, it is, I will agree, it's a lot of questions and it is a multi-year project to do them separately.
I mean, I could pick out 6 if you push me to it. I'm open to the idea of what Councilmember Marsh Olson, and this would be the election to try it, is just to make a mass overhaul, repeal and get it done with the exception that he pulled out. I don't know how other council members feel about it or what they're, but I'm open to that discussion.
All right, Councilmember Henkel.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for this organization. Nancy Rogers, I just really appreciate all the work that you have put into this and also our review committee. I did need to just sort of ask the question, what does repeal reenactment actually look like as in comparison to what we could be doing? So what does that look like for the voter on their ballot?
Sorry. Thanks for the question, Councilmember Hinkle. So the question would be, shall the Broomfield Charter be repealed and replaced with a charter that's been made widely available? So the question is very simple. It's one sentence, but it's making sure that people are looking at the right replacement charter. And so this is where it can get a little tough as far as how we educate our voters, because after the ballot question is approved, we can't advocate for it, but we would provide information, make sure people have a red line version, they have a clean version, that they know what that replacement charter is going to look like. So the question is actually fairly simple, but understanding the implications of the yes vote is a little more complicated.
Okay. And then how many other ballot questions is there going to be potentially on our ballots this fall?
It's really hard to say. Actually, we were talking in the break about the initiatives that are right now getting, there's so many, and some have been approved, but they're waiting on approval for circulation. Some are getting challenged at the Supreme Court on single subject. It's more than 10, it's more than 15. Yeah, easily. And that's really only the state ones. And we know that Adams County has a bond measure. So we'll have other local ones that'll come up. DA Mason would like to add a question about his term limit. And that's in addition to all the elected seats that are up.
Did you have something to say, Manager
18 to
Hoffman?
20.
Sorry.
18 to 20.
18 to 20, okay. That being said, I didn't honestly fully understand what repeal reenactment meant. I mean, for the voter. So I appreciate Councilmember Marsh Holshan's viewpoint and his advocacy, because I think he's been repeating this 2 or 3 times. I would like to say that I think that there are certain things that are not controversial, but I think everything can be controversial, right? We can look at the news and it can be controversial. I feel that if we're going to move forward with term limits with the 17th Judicial, that we might as well put that in there as well, just to be consistent with what else is going on. And I am for the repeal reenactment if it's going to make it more simple for the voters and include, I'm not a huge fan of including the wards discussion yet, so section 4.2, but I think that we have a lot of things in here that we could add in. And I do have a sort of a priority list, but I think that if we can make it simple for the voters, and then we direct people to what would be on that repeal reenactment, I do think that that would be an efficient use of government, to use the words of the other side, I would say. So, thank you.
Follow up, Mayor? Sure. That's okay. Councilmember Hinkle, so a full repeal reenactment, but potentially not all the questions that are listed on this chart. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah,
Okay.
just to make things even more simple.
Okay, got it.
I mean, we could pare down quite a bit, I think, to a certain degree. But I don't think term limits are controversial per se, because you're still voting that person in. You know, it's not like you're forcing somebody's, campaign against the will of the people, right? So you're still having to vote them in. It's just providing consistency, and we have to listen to our charter review committee. They did suggest that. So I'm for full repeal reenactment, and I appreciate the time.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Ward.
Thank you, Mayor. I will also entertain the idea of doing a full repeal and reenact. But if that doesn't go through, I do have a list. Um, so I think, my top 5 would be changes, the changes to be made throughout the charter of going to city and county. That's fairly not inconsequential, that's fairly, benign, I think, to most voters. And then I think elections would be another one that would be important. 4.7 would be my number 3. Just doing all of that. And then 4th would probably be, and we could do finance and budget and then taxation for number 5. I think those would probably be my top 5 to do for the time being. And then there was one more. So 6.9. We'll just do 6. Let's just add more. Why not? 6.9. So maybe take out taxation since it's already a moot point. It's not that big of a deal, but and replace that with 6.9 for publication of ordinances.
Thank you. Councilmember Leslie.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to agree with my colleague, Councilmember Marsh Hulshan, on the concept that this should be done quickly. I would like to suggest that any way we could consolidate these items and also separate those things that could be done by code, as you suggested, that we do that. We try to narrow this down to as few questions as possible that make sense legally and otherwise politically. I tend to also agree that the issue of term limit isn't that controversial. We might make it more controversial by separating it out. And so I'm more inclined to think we should include it in the whole and just do it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Councilmember Lim.
Do we have any recent evidence of any government entity doing the complete charter repeal and reenactment, and what the voter response was?
Not a full repeal and reenact. The closest we have is the transition from statutory to home rule, where somebody's adopting a charter for the first time, and that's a little
Erie
different.
just did that.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm hesitant to go there. I understand what Councilmember Marsh Hulshan is saying. Well, we try it 1 year. And then if it doesn't work, well, we're just out 1 year. But at the same time, I mean, staff has high priority items listed. And if we're not very confident that the electorate is going to, let's say, if we're not, there's too many negatives. If we feel that there's a possibility that the electorate would not feel comfortable with that entirety of repeal and replacement, then we've lost a whole year on those staff high priority items. And that is my hesitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Wynn.
Thank you, Mayor. I think we gotta get this done pretty quick. I mean, this is, we all know this is gonna be a very consequential election year already. Broomfield has extremely high voter turnout compared to most other parts of the state. I feel like the most amount of voters should get the most amount of say in a lot of these priorities and these, big changes that will affect their local community. I think we had this issue last time as well in our study sessions is what is a priority. I think all of them are priorities, if I want to be honest. And then this is where it makes it very difficult because I feel like we're making a couple of assumptions, but anyway, I just think we should, I appreciate staff's work on this. This is very important and I've said my piece. So thank you so much.
So is that a support of a full repeal and reenact or?
Support, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Councilmember Delgadillo.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess I'll provide my very tepid support for a repeal and reenactment. I think I appreciate my colleagues who have a lot of faith in this. I'm a little more nervous about the outcome of it, but it could save us quite a bit of time. I do acknowledge that. I think if not that though, I would say we need to focus on everything flagged as that staff high or medium priority. I think that amounts to kind of a fair number, but I will throw a 6 out of 10 lukewarm support behind that repeal and reenactment. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. So I am, I'm a little less than lukewarm. I don't know what that would be. Cold, maybe, on the repeal and reenactment. I think that in the end, we have to decide what is included with that repeal and reenactment, and probably more importantly, what is not included. And so we're going to have to go through this conversation regardless of what strategy we use. And so I think it's important that we identify what are those things that need to go onto this year's ballot, whether we go the strategy of reenactment or not. And again, more importantly, what's not on that list. So my top 5 priorities for 2024, the election section is one of those. If we do include the recall part 3.5 of that, I think that if it can be included in the same section, limited into that Title I provision within there, I think it makes a lot of sense. The publication of ordinances, that is one that causes us staff time as well as resources. If we can clean that one up, it's just outdated, and that would be a great cleanup for us. The municipal court, I think, is one of those that this is one of our functions that that we don't always talk about, but it is one of those that I do believe that we need to clean up sooner rather than later. Personal Merit Commission, that is one that that is identified within the charter, that we've done a lot of movement with our other boards and commissions that we haven't necessarily dealt with, but because this one's in our charter, I think that we need to take care of this one. And then, of course, the overall boards and commissions section, that is another one that I think that cleaning that up in the charter allows us to then be able to do the sufficient work that needs to happen within our boards and commissions, as that is one of our major advisory boards and our job as council members. So those are my top 5. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Any other first round feedback? Well, I have a bit of experience with ballot questions, and I can tell you this, that if it's all one target, it'll be easier to hit. Think about the omnibus bill that failed last year because it was trying to do too many things. So it failed. Separated, it passed. Correct? Now, we care about these things because internally we're dealing with it from day to day and we know what they are, but the average person that lives here doesn't understand it. They don't get the legalities and the updates or the nuances. And it would be on us, the burden on us to educate all these people as to why this is important. That's a big lift. Now, the opposing forces will go really hard at this, and they will raise money and they will have campaigns to kill it. I've done this for many years, and I can tell you from the interest in those who attended the CRC meetings, they will mobilize and it'll be one big target instead of several. So that's my cautionary tale. And if it's an all or nothing, because the burden will be on us again, where we don't have the resources to run a campaign, to raise money, to really educate our voters as to why this is important. I think when they stand alone and people can read it on their ballot, you'll have a much better chance of getting approval because that's what people do. They read their ballot. They rarely read the blue book. They're going to be bombarded with all types of media for all the other ballot questions. And it's going to be a bunch of messages coming at every one of us. So that would be my only cautionary tale. I get the efficiency. I totally do. But I think it presents a separate set of challenges because there are folks that just don't think we should change anything. I agree with Mayor Pro Tem. If you need a tiebreaker. So that's all I have to say. Any second round comments? Councilmember Cohen,
No, I thought James had already hit it. Do you want to go first?
you got the,
Well,
I saw you first, but.
I guess I hit it.
Okay,
Sorry.
go.
I actually have a slightly different take, considering that the ballot will be so crowded with probably the property tax thing, the abortion rights, the gay rights, and there's 24 out for signatures right now. There'll be more, maybe 10 or 12 will make it to the ballot. If we're concerned about ballot fatigue, I think it'd be fatiguing to put up 5 charter and try and educate on 5 very narrowly defined, described government minutia. I don't want to have to go out and explain the personnel merit charter and why that's separated out from the other 5 and why we put those 5 first. I think a different strategy is that we say this is a recommended by the committee, clean, up and down upgrade after how many years. And I kind of think voters will be like, we trust you and we move on, rather than trying to educate people about so many different issues. So I'm thinking that might be the better way to go. And it'd be simpler for voters to have a yes, no on the whole thing. One question I had is I'm not quite sure how we would pull out something like term limits from a total up and down, unless we just delete it from the charter. And that would be just a separate measure, or it'd have to be run on a separate election.
It would have to, if it's not included in this full repeal and reenact, it'd have to be a separate question in the future.
Separate question.
Yeah. And so right now there's not term limits in it. So
It'd be a separate
yeah,
question to,
picture the red line, we would just not include it.
so could you potentially could have the charter fail and the term limits pass, or vice versa?
Oh, if we were doing a full repeal and reenact and a separate question? Yeah, you could have that.
Anyway, I'm leaning more toward the total. I think it's easier actually on the voters and reflects the recommendations of the commission or the committee.
Thank you. Councilmember Marshall Olson.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with what Councilmember Cohen just said. I do think that now that I've heard more comments, I do think including the term limits in the ballot question is probably the fair thing. It is a recommendation of the Charter Review Committee. I think the only thing we could pull out maybe is the things that could be done by ordinance, like the ballot or the ward mapping stuff. But if we just go with what the committee recommended, I think that's an easier sell to the voters. And it's an easy sell because I think we've grown, we've doubled in size in 20 years. And I think this is the time that we needed to update. To the mayor's point, I do understand, don't disagree with your point that it will be an easy target for certain people on certain things. The only thing I'll say to that is, strictly speaking from politics, that side of the population hasn't won an election in Broomfield in a very long time. So I'm not really concerned as much on that one. But I don't know. You make a point. I understand that. And I guess I do think it would pass. I do think that we have grown so much, it's time for Broomfield to update our charter. I think that's an easy sell to the voters. So that's it. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Henkel?
Thank you. Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I think even if we do have a certain subset of information, there's going to be funding against it anyway. Literally almost everything that we put forward at council, we receive feedback from the same 10 to 15 people that are usually in the minority, and where there's ways that we can move forward with this and have a huge public process. I don't want to add voter fatigue to this. And then if it doesn't work, we can always revamp it the next year. I will say that they will put any money and all money towards something that they feel very passionately about, so.
Thank you. Any other council member questions? Yeah, I'll tell you about the mill levy float that failed miserably that one year, but Gallagher got repealed. Yes, Ms. Hoffman.
Just from the staff conversation, if council would entertain it, the most important ones to us fundamentally is the elections, not 3.5, but 3.1 and 3.2. If council would entertain having that be a separate full repeal, this is a really important one. And it's not a staff really important one. It's a community really important one to be able to identify the title for these elections. So if it all goes down, then it's, that's a tough one for us to continue to move through. And we don't think that it's one that's either going to make or break the recall. Somebody's not going to say, yes, let's do a full repeal because there's this one piece in there with regards to the election. So not ballot fatigue, but it is one that is 3.1 and 3.2. It's a very important one for the community. And I don't mean community as in community residents. I mean holding a high fidelity election.
Okay. So you are recommending that if we decide to go forward with the full repeal and reenact, we still have a standalone question for the election section? 3.1 and 3.2.
Yes.
Okay. Well, let's poll council. I wish we had a Mentometer or some kind of meter, but anyway. Oh, button. Councilmember Marshall.
I understand what you're saying, but I don't think I can support that. I think that I completely understand what you're saying and what it means. But I think the messaging on a full repeal and reenactment is the messaging on the full repeal and enactment. And anything you break out takes away from that messaging. Because why are we taking that one out? And we've been operating under it for years. What practical effect does it have in the next year, I guess is the question.
It's very challenging for our county clerk to operate under Title 31, which is a municipal election code, and also be running the county elections, which are Title I. So there's some inconsistencies between the two, and we've had to make the call. And I say we, like legal, working with the clerk's office over the years, have had to make the call that, well, do it this way. And recall is one of those areas where there was some push and pull. So you're right, we've come away unscathed, but the risk there is, I would hate for somebody to challenge something we did in the election saying you followed 31 and you should have followed 1. The other thing I want to add is this is just a study session. You still have the chance to approve or not approve the actual ordinance. And I will tell you, it's not a much bigger lift for me to prepare both a repeal reenact ordinance and an ordinance with that Title I question. And then you could have that discussion and that vote at that meeting. And I remind you, repeal and reenact needs to pass by 2/3. Simple majority, single questions need to pass by a majority. So that might be a reason to at least have this debate and discussion at the ordinance level.
That makes sense.
That sounds fair. Does that help? Councilmember Marshall? Okay, Councilmember Cohen?
Understand how we would tell the public that this is really important, but we're worried this won't pass, so this is super important. But please be sure to vote for this one, but I don't know about the rest. I don't know how I would explain that rationale that they're all important, but this one's super important, so we pulled it out. But can you back up on you said it's 50% by themselves?
Full repeals and reenactments of charters require a supermajority approval of the ballot question ordinance. ballot question ordinances, when there's just a single subject, only requires a majority vote of council.
Council.
Sorry, of council. I apologize.
Thank you.
That would be a reason not to do it. Okay, cool. Anyone else? All right, so that sounds like we have a plan to bring back the repeal and reenact with the separate election section question for consideration, and we'll debate and figure out how many folks want to do it that way.
Yes.
Does that work for you?
And if I understand it right, so the red line is including everything on here. Yeah, okay. And there was only, I think different than what the Charter Review Committee recommended, we being council modified vacancies a little bit as far as the mayor filled the appointment by the mayor pro tem. You had that discussion last meeting. And then the recall provision was modified a little bit, that charter controls, then code, then Title I. So that was all things that we got council direction last time. That will be reflected in the ordinance I prepare.
All right.
All right.
Everybody good with that?
Mayor, just timing, I am planning first reading on June 11th and second reading on July 9th.
Okay,
Okay.
that sounds
Cool.
like a plan.
All right.
Thank you all so much for hanging in there, and especially Ms. Rogers and our Charter Review Committee members for getting us to this point. That concludes the agenda items for this evening study session. There being no further business, the study session is adjourned. Good night.